Hey guys, tonight we are stepping through a doorway that smells like horse manure, boiled cabbage, and ambition. It is the year 1905, and you're standing on the corner of Mulberry Street in Lower Manhattan, blinking against a pale winter sun that barely cuts through the haze of coal smoke drifting over the rooftops. Around you, pushcart vendors are screaming prices in 4 languages you do not speak. A horse pulling a delivery wagon has just relieved itself spectacularly in the middle of the road, and somewhere above your head, a woman is hanging laundry on a rope stretched between 2 tenement buildings that look like they might collapse before the sheets dry. Welcome to New York City. You probably will not survive the week, and honestly, the odds are not great even for the people who were born here. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. While you're at it, drop a comment telling me where you are listening from and what time it is where you are. I always love reading those. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You wake up. That is the first thing. You wake up, and for a moment you have absolutely no idea where you are. The ceiling is about 7 feet above your face, stained brown from years of tobacco smoke and cooking grease and the slow leaking of the apartment above yours. The room is small, not small the way a modern studio apartment is small the way a walk-in closet is small, except this walk-in closet has 5 people sleeping in it. You're on a narrow cot pushed against one wall. Beside you, on a straw mattress laid directly on the wooden floor, your cousin and his wife are curled together under a single wool blanket. In the corner, 2 boarders, men you met for the first time 3 weeks ago when you moved in, are sleeping on what can only be described as a plank of wood balanced on 2 chairs. One of them is snoring with a ferocity that rattles the single window in its frame. This is a tenement apartment on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. The building is 5 stories tall, maybe 6. It was built sometime in the 1870s, back when developers realized they could cram the maximum number of human beings into the minimum amount of space and charge every single one of them rent. The apartment you're in is what they call a railroad flat, named because the rooms are lined up one behind the other like the cars of a train. You walk through the front room to get to the middle room and through the middle room to get to the back room. There are no hallways. Privacy is a concept you have heard about in theory. The Tenement House Act of 1901 was supposed to fix all of this. The city passed it with great fanfare, requiring new buildings to have better ventilation, indoor toilets, and larger windows. Historians still argue whether this law actually improved conditions in any meaningful time frame, or whether it simply created a 2-tier system where new buildings were marginally less awful, while the old ones continued rotting. Either way, you're living in an old one, so the law's benefits are largely academic to you. Your apartment has 3 rooms totaling about 325 square feet. For this, you pay somewhere around $12 a month, which does not sound like much until you consider that you earn maybe $6 to $8 a week in a good week, and a good week is not guaranteed. To make the rent work, you take in boarders. Almost everyone does. The Department of Health estimates that parts of the Lower East Side have a population density of more than 300,000 people per square mile, making it one of the most densely packed places on the planet in 1905. For perspective, modern-day Manhattan averages about 72,000, so multiply the current crowding by roughly 4 and you're getting close. You swing your legs off the cot and your bare feet hit the floor, which is cold and slightly sticky. There is a peculiar smell in the room, a combination of unwashed bodies, damp wool, the remains of last night's dinner, and something else you cannot identify but suspect might be the bucket in the corner that serves as the overnight toilet because nobody's walking down 5 flights of stairs to the outhouse in the courtyard at 3 in the morning. That bucket is a fact of life. You try not to think about it too hard. Light is coming in through the single window that faces the air shaft. Air shafts were a brilliant innovation of tenement architecture. Narrow vertical channels cut between buildings that were supposed to provide ventilation and light to the interior rooms. What they actually provide is a convenient garbage chute for every apartment above you, and an echo chamber that amplifies the sounds of arguments, crying babies, and the occasional chicken that someone is keeping illegally on the 4th floor. The light coming through your window right now is grey and thin, filtered through the accumulated grime on the glass, and whatever is hanging in the air shaft between you and the sky. You know it is morning because you can hear the building waking up, footsteps on the stairs, the clang of a pot somewhere, a child crying. The man in the apartment directly above yours has started his morning cough. a deep, rattling, wet sound that goes on for several minutes. You've been hearing that cough get worse for weeks, and you try not to think about what it means, though you know. Everyone in the building knows. There's a quirky little detail about tenement life in this era that most people never hear about. Some landlords in the Lower East Side actually rented sleeping space in shifts. You would pay a few cents a night for a spot on the floor, and when your 8 hours were up, someone else would take your place. They called these hotbeds because the mattress, if you could call it that, was still warm from the last person. One investigator from the time noted finding 15 people sleeping in a room the size of a modern parking space, in rotating shifts, 24 hours a day. The room never went empty. You stand up, stretch in the tiny space between your cot and the wall, and you begin the process of getting ready for the day. This process is going to be nothing like what you're used to. The first order of business is personal hygiene, and you should prepare yourself for disappointment. There is no shower in your apartment. There is no bathtub. There is in fact no running hot water at all. If you are fortunate, there is a single cold water tap somewhere in the building, possibly in the hallway on your floor, possibly in the hallway one floor down, possibly in the basement. The 1901 Tenement House Act required running water on every floor, but enforcement is spotty, and your building predates the law anyway, so you take what you get. You grab a tin basin from under the cot and make your way out of the apartment and down the hallway to the tap. The hallway is dark. It is always dark. There is one small window at the end of the corridor, and it faces another air shaft, and the accumulated grime makes it nearly opaque. You navigate partly by memory and partly by feel, stepping carefully, because the floorboards are uneven, and the last thing you need is a twisted ankle before a 12-hour workday. At the tap, you fill the basin with water so cold it makes your teeth ache. You carry it back to the apartment, set it on the floor, and splash your face. That is your morning wash. A full bath is a weekend luxury, if it happens at all. Some tenement buildings have a shared bathtub in the basement, but the line is long and the water is heated on a coal stove, so the whole process can take half a day. Public bathhouses exist throughout the Lower East Side, and they are genuinely popular. The city opened several free public baths in the early 1900s, and on a hot summer day, the lines stretch around the block. But in March, on a regular workday morning, you make do with a tin basin and the cold water. Now the toilet situation. Your apartment does not have one. The 1901 law required new tenements to have a toilet for every 2 apartments, connected to the sewer system. But in your building, the facilities consist of outhouses in the rear courtyard, shared among every tenant on the floor, sometimes shared among every tenant in the building. We're talking about 1 or 2 wooden structures servicing dozens of people. In winter, the trip to the courtyard is an act of genuine courage. In summer, the smell makes the journey an act of genuine suffering. The outhouses are cleaned by the landlord, theoretically, but the reality is that they are cleaned when someone complains loudly enough, or when the Board of Health inspector shows up, whichever comes first. Historians still argue whether the public health improvements of this era were driven more by genuine reform movements, or by the practical terror that disease epidemics would spread from the tenements into wealthier neighbourhoods. The answer is probably both, but the second motivation had considerably more funding behind it. There is an interesting and somewhat stomach-turning detail about waste management in New York in this period. Some tenement buildings had what were called school sinks, large open troughs in the basement or courtyard connected to the sewer, shared by the entire building. These were supposed to be an improvement over individual outhouses, but in practice they were perpetually clogged, overflowing, and surrounded by a miasma that could strip paint. An inspector from the tenement house department documented one building where the school sink had been broken for 3 months, and the entire basement was flooded with raw sewage to a depth of several inches. The landlord's response when located was that he had not been informed. The tenants, who had been walking through the sewage daily, found this claim unconvincing. You get dressed. Your clothing is utilitarian and limited. If you're a working man, you have perhaps 2 shirts, both made of heavy cotton or wool. You have 1 pair of trousers for work and 1 pair for whatever passes for your social life. You have a vest, because men in 1905 wear vests even when they are poor, and a heavy wool coat that you bought second-hand from a pushcart on Hester Street. Your shoes are the most critical item you own. They are leather, they are heavy, and they are in constant need of repair. A good pair of shoes can cost $1.50, which represents a significant chunk of your weekly income. You cannot afford to replace them, so you visit the cobbler on the corner regularly, and he patches and resoles them until the upper leather simply gives out. Socks are wool. Underwear is a union suit, a one-piece garment that covers you from wrist to ankles, buttoned up the front. You have been wearing the same one for several days, because laundry is a major production. If you are a woman in this building, your morning is even more complicated. You're likely already up before the men, because someone needs to start the coal stove, someone needs to begin preparing breakfast, and someone needs to get the children ready. Women's clothing in 1905 is an engineering project. You are wearing a chemise, then a corset. Yes, even working-class women wear corsets, though theirs are less restrictive than the wasp-waisted contraptions of the upper classes. Then a petticoat, then a skirt that reaches your ankles, then a shirtwaist blouse. Getting dressed takes time. Your hair needs to be pinned up because a respectable woman does not go out with her hair down. The whole process, from waking to walking out the door, takes longer than you might expect when every step involves navigating around 5 other people in 300 square feet. A note on laundry, because it is one of those things modern people never think about. There are no washing machines. Laundry is done by hand in a wash tub, using a washboard, lye soap, and a considerable amount of physical labour. It takes most of a day to do a full load, and then everything has to be hung to dry, either in the apartment, on the fire escape, or on a line strung across the air shaft. In winter, clothes freeze on the line and have to be brought in stiff as boards. Many families send their laundry out to professional laundresses who charge by the piece, or they use the commercial laundries that are starting to appear in the neighbourhood. But this costs money, and money is the thing you have least of. You look in the cracked mirror propped on the windowsill and assess yourself. You look tired. You are tired. You went to bed at 10:30 after a 12-hour day, and you are up at 5:30 to do it again. Your face is pale because you spend most of your daylight hours indoors, and the sunlight that reaches your apartment would not ripen a tomato. You run a comb through your hair, straighten your vest, and head for the kitchen, which is also the living room, which is also the dining room, which is also the room where your cousin and his wife sleep. Time for breakfast. Breakfast in your tenement apartment in 1905 is not the Instagram-worthy spread you might be imagining. There is no avocado toast, obviously, but there is also no fresh orange juice, no cereal from a box, and no toaster waiting on a clean countertop. What there is a cast-iron coal stove shoved against one wall. It is the heart of the apartment, the source of heat, and the only way to cook, and it is temperamental, smoky, and perpetually hungry for fuel. Someone, probably the woman of the household, has already gotten it going this morning, feeding it chunks of coal purchased from the coalman who comes through the neighbourhood with a horse-drawn cart. Coal costs money, so the stove runs as efficiently as possible, which means the apartment is warm near the stove, and progressively colder the farther you get from it. On the stove sits a kettle and a pot. The kettle is for coffee, which is less a beverage and more a survival mechanism. Coffee in the tenements is made by boiling ground coffee directly in water, straining it through a cloth and hoping for the best. The result is strong, bitter and gritty. It bears about as much resemblance to what you would get at a modern coffee shop as a horse bears to a sports car. They are technically in the same category, but the experience is fundamentally different. Still, it is hot and it has caffeine, and in a cold tenement at 5:30 in the morning, that is enough. The bread is the centerpiece of breakfast. You buy it from a bakery on the block. There are bakeries everywhere on the Lower East Side, because bread is the single most important food in the immigrant diet. A loaf of rye bread costs about 5 cents. It is dense, chewy, and filling. If it is fresh, it is genuinely delicious. If it is a day old, it is still edible. If it is 2 days old, you toast it on the stove and it becomes edible again. You slice it thick and you might spread it with a scraping of butter or a bit of rendered chicken fat, which is called schmaltz, and is used the way modern people use olive oil. On everything, for everything. Here is a mainstream historical fact that frames your entire breakfast experience. In 1905, there are essentially no federal food safety laws in the United States. None. The Pure Food and Drug Act will not pass until 1906, partly inspired by Upton Sinclair's novel The Jungle, which will describe conditions in the meatpacking industry so revolting that the entire country will collectively lose its appetite. But right now, in your kitchen, the food you're eating exists in a regulatory vacuum. Your milk, if you can afford it, may be adulterated with water, chalk or formaldehyde to keep it from spoiling. Your bread might contain alum to make it whiter. Your coffee might be stretched with ground chicory, roasted grain, or in the most creative cases, sawdust. You do not know this, and frankly, if you did know, you would probably still eat it because the alternative is not eating. Milk is a particular horror story. Fresh milk in New York City in this era is delivered by horse-drawn wagon from dairies that range from reasonably clean to unbelievably filthy. Pasteurization exists as a concept. Louis Pasteur developed the process decades ago, but it is not yet required by law, and much of the milk sold in the tenement districts is raw. Milk from so-called swill dairies, operations where cows are fed the leftover mash from whiskey distilleries and kept in conditions that would make a modern health inspector faint, is still reaching consumers, though reformers like Nathan Strauss have been campaigning for years to establish pasteurized milk stations for the poor. The infant mortality rate in New York City is closely tied to milk quality. Babies fed contaminated milk develop what they call summer complaint, basically severe diarrheal disease, and die in staggering numbers. The death rate for children under 5 in some Lower East Side neighbourhoods exceeds 1 in 4. 1 in 4. Let that settle in your mind as you sip your gritty coffee. You finish breakfast quickly. A slice or two of bread, the coffee, maybe a bit of herring if the household budget allows. Salt herring is cheap, shelf-stable and ubiquitous in immigrant kitchens. You can buy it from a barrel at any number of shops on the street. It is salty enough to preserve itself without refrigeration, which is good because you do not have refrigeration. You have an icebox, a wooden cabinet with a compartment for a block of ice. But ice costs money and has to be hauled up 5 flights of stairs, so the icebox is not always iced. In summer, food spoils fast. In winter, you can put things on the windowsill and let the cold do the work, though you risk losing your dinner to pigeons or to the enterprising child on the fire escape above you. Here is a quirky detail about food in this era that most people never encounter. Street vendors on the Lower East Side sell a bewildering variety of ready-to-eat foods, and some of them would strike a modern person as genuinely strange. You can buy baked sweet potatoes from a man with a coal-fired oven on a pushcart. You can buy roasted chestnuts, pickled oysters, hot corn on the cob in summer, and something called a tripe sandwich, which is exactly what it sounds like and costs 2 cents. One of the more unusual items is arbes, boiled chickpeas seasoned with salt and pepper, sold in paper cones by vendors who roam the streets calling out their wares in Yiddish. The whole culinary landscape of the Lower East Side is a collision of Eastern European Jewish cooking, Southern Italian cuisine, Chinese food from the small but growing Chinatown nearby, and whatever the Irish have been eating for the past 50 years, which by this point is a mixture of traditional and adapted dishes that would confuse a person from Dublin. You wipe your mouth, grab your coat, and head for the door. The building staircase is narrow, wooden, and alarmingly creaky. There is no elevator, the hallways are dark. As you descend, you pass open apartment doors. Some families leave them open for ventilation, especially in warmer weather, and you catch glimpses of other lives. A woman at a sewing machine, a man reading a Yiddish newspaper, 2 children playing on the floor with a rag ball. The sounds of the building layer on top of each other, a constant ambient hum of humanity that never really stops, day or night. You push open the front door and step into the street, and everything changes. The street hits you like a wall. It hits all your senses simultaneously and not gently. The first thing is the noise. 1905. New York does not have the steady background roar of automobile traffic that defines a modern city. What it has instead is louder in some ways and more chaotic in every way. Horses, hundreds of horses, thousands of horses, tens of thousands of horses. The city has an estimated 130,000 horses working within its boundaries, and every single one of them is clopping along on cobblestones or packed dirt, pulling wagons, carriages, carts and omnibuses. The sound of iron horseshoes on stone is constant and percussive, a rhythm that underlays everything else. On top of the horses there are the people. The Lower East Side in 1905 is one of the most densely populated places on Earth. Remember? And all those people are on the street. The sidewalks are packed. Pushcart vendors line the curbs on both sides, their wooden carts loaded with everything from vegetables to shoes to hardware to live chickens. Each vendor is calling out, advertising their goods at full volume. Some are singing, some are arguing with customers. A man selling eyeglasses from a folding table is shouting about the quality of his lenses. A woman behind a cart of apples is negotiating with another woman who insists the apples are bruised, a claim that is probably accurate given the supply chain involved in getting fruit to the Lower East Side. The street itself is cobblestone, and it is covered, Not dotted, not spotted, but covered, and horse manure. An average horse produces between 15 and 30 pounds of manure per day, and with 130,000 horses in the city, New York is dealing with millions of pounds of the stuff daily. The city employs street sweepers, but they cannot keep up. In summer, the manure dries in the sun and crumbles into a fine dust that gets into everything: your clothes, your hair, your lungs. In winter, it freezes into solid mounds that horses and pedestrians navigate around. In spring, it becomes a slurry of mud, manure and snowmelt that can soak through your shoes in seconds. Crossing the street is an adventure. There are no crosswalks, no traffic signals, no particular rules about who goes where. You pick your way between horses, dodge a wagon, step over a pile of something you choose not to examine too closely, and arrive on the other side feeling like you have accomplished something significant. The smell. It is difficult to overstate the smell. You have the horse manure, obviously, but layered on top of that is a complex bouquet of other odours. Garbage collection in the tenement districts is irregular at best. Household waste is supposed to be placed in barrels at the curb, but the barrels overflow, and the collection wagons come when they come. Rotting vegetable matter, fish heads, bones, and less identifiable refuse pile up on the streets and in the vacant lots. The slaughterhouses and rendering plants scattered through the city add their own contribution to the atmosphere. Open sewers still exist in some areas, and even where the sewer system is closed, the infrastructure is overtaxed and backups are common. Add to this the smoke from thousands of coal stoves, the steam from laundries, the sharp chemical smell from the many small factories operating in converted buildings throughout the neighbourhood, and you have an olfactory environment that would make a modern person genuinely ill. Historians still argue whether New Yorkers in this era were truly nose-blind to their environment, or whether they simply had no frame of reference for anything better. The evidence suggests a bit of both. Reform literature of the period makes constant reference to the terrible conditions, but the reformers are typically middle-class outsiders. The people actually living in the tenements mention the smell less often in their own accounts, which might mean they had adapted or might mean they had more pressing concerns, like survival. Here is a detail about the streets that tends to surprise people: the dead horses. When a horse collapsed from exhaustion, illness, or injury, which happened with grim regularity, the body remained on the street until the city's dead horse removal service could get to it. This could take hours, or in busy times, days. The Department of Street Cleaning removed an average of 15,000 dead horses from the streets of New York each year in this period. 15,000! That is more than 40 per day. The carcasses attracted flies, rats, and dogs, and in hot weather the decomposition added yet another layer to the city's fragrance. Children played around them, vendors set up shop next to them. Life went on, because in 1905, New York, a dead horse is not an emergency. It is Tuesday. You navigate through all of this with the practiced efficiency of someone who has learned where to step and where not to step. You dodge a pushcart piled with fabric bolts. You sidestep a group of children running through the crowd. You avoid the stream of liquid running down the gutter from a source you decline to investigate. A newsboy is standing on the corner waving a newspaper and shouting something about a disaster somewhere, or a scandal somewhere else, or both. You do not stop to buy one. Not yet. You have somewhere to be. Above your head, the city rises. The tenement buildings on either side of the street are 5 and 6 stories tall, their facades decorated with iron fire escapes that double as additional living space in warm weather. Laundry flutters from lines strung between buildings. Faces appear in windows. Someone empties a basin of water from an upper story, and you step aside just in time to avoid the splash. This is technically illegal, but so is most of what happens on the Lower East Side, and enforcement is a flexible concept. In the distance, looking uptown, you can see the emerging skyline of a city in transformation. The Flatiron Building, completed just 3 years ago, is still a novelty, its triangular shape rising 22 stories into the sky. The Times Tower in Longacre Square, which will soon be renamed Times Square, is under construction. The city is building upward because it has run out of room to build outward, at least on the island of Manhattan, and the technology of steel frame construction and electric elevators is making the impossible suddenly possible. But here on the Lower East Side, the skyline is still human scale, a row of tenement rooftops that stretches to the horizon in every direction, punctuated by church steeples, synagogue domes, and the occasional factory chimney belching smoke into an already grey sky. You check your pocket watch, if you own one. If you do not, you check the clock on the bank building you pass every morning, or you estimate the time by the light, or you simply walk faster because being late is not an option. Getting to work is an adventure in itself, and the way you do it depends on where you work and how much you can afford to spend on the trip. If you are lucky enough to work within walking distance of your tenement, and many people on the Lower East Side do, because the garment factories and sweatshops are concentrated in the same neighbourhood where the workers live, then you walk. You join the river of humanity flowing along the sidewalks, and you move at whatever pace the crowd allows, which is often surprisingly fast despite the obstacles. New Yorkers have always walked fast. It is practically genetic at this point. But if you work uptown, or across the river, or in one of the industrial districts farther north, you need transportation. And in 1905, New York has a transit system that is simultaneously a marvel of engineering and a test of your will to live. The most dramatic option is the subway. The Interborough Rapid Transit System, or IRT, opened just over a year ago, in October of 1904. It is the first underground rapid transit system in New York City, and it is, in the truest sense of the word, revolutionary. For a single nickel, 5 cents, you can ride from City Hall all the way to Harlem in about 15 minutes, a journey that previously took over an hour by surface transit. The system is gleaming and new, with tiled stations decorated in ceramic mosaics, brass fixtures, and electric lighting. The cars are heated in winter, which makes the subway infinitely more comfortable than the alternatives. On opening day, over 150,000 people rode the system, many of them just for the thrill of it. Within a year, it is carrying hundreds of thousands of passengers daily, but the subway has problems. There are not enough cars, there are not enough stations, and the crowds are already overwhelming the system's capacity. During rush hour, the platforms are packed so tightly that people are sometimes pushed onto the tracks. The cars are designed to hold perhaps 60 passengers. They regularly carry twice that. You are pressed against strangers so closely that pickpockets have a field day. Though in fairness, you are pressed so closely that it is also difficult to move your hands to steal anything. The air underground is stale and warm, a mixture of tunnel dust, coal dust from the power plant, and the exhalations of several hundred tightly packed humans. After a few stops, the windows fog over. Someone once described the morning rush on the early IRT as being packed into a sardine tin, except the sardines have opinions and body odour. Historians still argue whether the subway immediately democratised New York, or whether it initially served as the dividing line, with certain neighbourhoods benefiting from stations while others were deliberately bypassed. If the subway does not serve your route, you have the elevated trains, the Ls. These are older than the subway, having been running since the 1870s, and they are both a marvel and a nuisance. The ELs run on elevated tracks above the avenues, supported by iron columns that march down the middle of the street, like the skeleton of some enormous metal beast. The trains are pulled by small steam locomotives, though some lines have already converted to electric power by 1905, and they rattle along the tracks with a sound that reverberates through the buildings on either side. If you live near an L line, the noise is part of your life. The trains run from early morning to late at night, and the rumble, crash rumble of their passage becomes a kind of urban heartbeat. Riding the L is an experience. You climb a narrow iron staircase to the platform, which sways slightly in the wind because it is, after all, a structure made of iron beams, suspended 30 feet above the street. You wait on the platform and look down at the city below. The tops of horse-drawn wagons, the hats of pedestrians, the general chaos of the street seen from above. When the train arrives, you board a wooden car that is open to the elements at both ends. In summer, cinders from the locomotive float back into the cars and settle on your clothes. In winter, the cars are unheated and the wind blows through the open vestibules with knife-like efficiency. The fare is a nickel, same as the subway. Then there are the streetcars. Horse-drawn streetcars have been gradually replaced by electric trolleys, and by 1905 the transformation is well underway. The trolleys run on tracks embedded in the street, powered by overhead wires, and they are everywhere. They're also overcrowded, slow, and given to stopping suddenly when the trolley pole disconnects from the wire, which happens with irritating frequency. You can also take a horse-drawn omnibus, though these are being phased out by the electric trolleys. There is a wonderful and slightly terrifying quirk about New York transit in this era. The Brooklyn Bridge, which connects Manhattan to Brooklyn across the East River, has been open since 1883, and by 1905 it carries an astonishing amount of traffic. Elevated trains run across the bridge on its own dedicated tracks. Trolleys run across the bridge. Horse-drawn vehicles cross the bridge. Pedestrians walk across the bridge. And all of this happens on a structure that, when it was built, was the longest suspension bridge in the world and was regarded with a mixture of awe and terror by the public. In the early years, people were so afraid the bridge would collapse that P.T. Barnum famously marched a herd of elephants across it to prove it was safe. By 1905, the fear has mostly subsided, but the bridge is so congested that crossing it during rush hour is an exercise in patience and creative profanity. You choose your route, pay your nickel, and squeeze on to whatever conveyance is available. The morning commute takes you from the dense, low-rise world of the Lower East Side into the increasingly vertical world of Midtown and Uptown Manhattan, or perhaps across the bridge into Brooklyn, where factories and warehouses line the waterfront. You stand in the crowd, pressed between strangers, holding on to a strap or a pole, watching the city slide past the windows. It is grimy and loud and uncomfortable, and you do not think about it much because you do it every day, and there is nothing to be done about it. This is the cost of living in the greatest city in the world, though some mornings, squeezed into a subway car with your face in some stranger's armpit, the greatness feels somewhat abstract. You arrive at your stop and climb back up into daylight, or you step off the trolley, or you finish your walk. Either way, you are at work. The clock is ticking, the foreman is watching, and the day is just beginning. You push through the door of the factory and the air changes instantly. Outside it was cold and sharp and smelled like horses and coal smoke. Inside it is warm and close and smells like fabric, machine oil and human sweat. You're in the garment district, which in 1905 is not so much a district as an ecosystem that has taken over entire blocks of the Lower East Side and is beginning to spread northward into what will eventually become the Midtown Garment Center. The garment industry is the beating heart of the immigrant economy. More than half the workers in New York's clothing factories are recent immigrants, mostly from Eastern Europe, and the industry employs tens of thousands of them. The work ranges from large, relatively organised factories down to tiny sweatshops operating out of converted apartments where a contractor, a few sewing machines, and a dozen workers produce garments for pennies per piece. You happen to work in a mid-sized factory on the upper floors of a building that was never designed to be a factory, which is to say it has narrow staircases, insufficient ventilation, and windows that have been nailed shut to prevent fabric from blowing around in drafts. The windows nailed shut detail will become horrifyingly relevant 6 years from now at the Triangle Shirtwaist factory, but in this moment, it is just another fact of your working life. You hang your coat on a hook, there is no locker, no changing room, just a row of hooks on the wall near the door, and take your place at your station. If you are a sewing machine operator, your station is a cast-iron Singer machine on a long wooden table, lined up beside 20 or 30 identical machines. If you are a presser, you work with a heavy iron heated on a gas flame, pressing finished garments. If you are a cutter, you work at a large table with fabric stacked in layers, cutting patterns with heavy shears. And if you're at the bottom of the hierarchy, you are a thread cutter or a finisher, sitting on a bench doing handwork, trimming threads, sewing on buttons, adding final touches for the lowest wages in the shop. The workday is 12 hours, sometimes 13, sometimes 14. The concept of an 8-hour workday exists in 1905, but mostly as a demand on protest signs. The typical garment worker starts at 7 in the morning and works until 7 or 8 at night, with a half-hour break for lunch. During busy season, the weeks before fashion changes drive new orders, the hours stretch even longer, and workers may be expected to stay until midnight or beyond. This is called the task system or the section system, and it works like this. You are assigned a certain quantity of work for the day, and you do not leave until it is done. If you are fast, you might finish in 12 hours. If you're slow, or if the quantity is set unreasonably high, you're there until the gas lamps burn down. Your pay depends on what you do and how you do it. A skilled sewing machine operator might earn $12 to $15 a week during busy season. A presser might earn a bit more because the work is physically grueling. But these are the good wages. Thread cutters and finishers earn as little as $3 to $4 a week. Women, who make up a significant portion of the garment workforce, earn less than men for the same work. A pattern so consistent that it barely requires comment, though it is worth noting that the women of the garment industry are already beginning to organise and push back. The uprising of the 20,000, the massive strike of women shirtwaist workers, is just 4 years away, and the seeds of that movement are germinating right now in factories exactly like the one you're sitting in. Conditions in the factory are what a modern person would call unconscionable. The room is crowded. The machines are loud. The air is thick with fabric dust and lint that settles on everything and everyone. Ventilation comes from the occasional open transom window above a door, which does almost nothing. The lighting is a combination of gaslight and early electric bulbs, neither of which provides enough illumination for detailed handwork. So many workers develop eye problems within a few years. The floors are wooden and covered in scraps of fabric, thread, and the accumulated debris of production. Fire extinguishers, if they exist at all, are inadequate. Fire escapes are often blocked by stored materials. Exit doors are sometimes locked from the outside, ostensibly to prevent workers from stealing fabric or taking unauthorized breaks, but effectively creating a death trap. Here is a fact that often gets lost in the broader narrative of industrial history. Children are working in this factory beside you, not teenagers, actual children. A girl who looks maybe 12 is sitting at the end of the bench cutting threads. A boy of perhaps 10 is running between stations carrying bundles of fabric. Child labour is technically regulated in New York. The Compulsory Education Act requires children to attend school until age 14, but enforcement is weak, paperwork can be forged, and the economic pressure on immigrant families is immense. A child's earnings, even the few dollars a week they might bring home from factory work, can make the difference between a family paying rent and a family being evicted. So the children work, and everyone, the parents, the factory owner, the truant officers, engages in a collective act of looking the other way. There is a curious and deeply human detail about work culture in the garment shops that rarely makes it into history textbooks. Many shops had a reader. This was a worker, or sometimes an outsider, who would read aloud to the others while they worked. Newspapers, novels, political pamphlets, poetry. The reader provided both entertainment and education during the long hours. In some shops, the workers pooled their money to pay the reader, who was excused from physical labour in exchange for keeping the room supplied with stories and news. Historians still argue whether this practice was more common than the records suggest, or whether it has been romanticised in retrospect, but the accounts are widespread enough to suggest it was real and meaningful. Imagine it. A crowded, lint-filled room, the clatter of sewing machines, and a voice reading Chekhov or Tolstoy, or the daily Yiddish newspaper, the words floating above the noise like a lifeline to something beyond the factory walls. The foreman walks between the rows, watching. He is paid to maximise output and minimise costs, and he takes both responsibilities seriously. If you slow down, he notices. If you make a mistake, he notices. If you take too long in the toilet, he notices. The relationship between workers and management in the garment industry is tense, and growing more so. Unions are forming. The International Ladies Garment Workers Union was founded in 1900, and it is gaining strength rapidly. But union membership can cost you your job. So many workers are cautious, joining quietly, attending meetings in rented halls after dark, whispering about solidarity while the foreman's back is turned. You bend over your machine and you work. The needle moves, the fabric feeds through, the hours pass. Not everyone works in the garment shops, of course. If you head west and south from the Lower East Side, you hit the waterfront, and the waterfront in 1905 is another world entirely. The docks that line the Hudson River on the west side and the East River on the east side are the jugular veins of New York's economy, the points where the wealth of the world flows into the city and the products of the city flow out. And the men who work the docks are among the hardest working, hardest living, and most thoroughly exploited people in Manhattan. You arrive at the pier in the grey, early morning, joining a crowd of men who are already gathered at the entrance. This is the shape-up, the daily hiring ritual that determines whether you eat today or go hungry. The hiring boss, usually a foreman employed by the stevedoring company, stands at the pier entrance and looks over the crowd. He points, you, not you. The selection is arbitrary, or at least it appears arbitrary, but in reality it is governed by a system of favouritism, kickbacks, and gang affiliation that everyone understands and nobody discusses openly. If you are connected to the right people, you get work. If you've been paying a portion of your wages back to the foreman, a practice so common it has its own name, the kickback, you get work. If you showed up sober and looked strong enough, you might get work. If none of these things apply, you stand there until the boss waves the rest of the crowd away, and you go home empty-handed or you try your luck at the next pier. The work itself is brutally physical. Cargo ships are loaded and unloaded by hand, with the assistance of simple cranes and winches. Longshoremen carry, drag and stack everything from barrels of sugar to bales of cotton to crates of machinery. The loads are heavy. A barrel of sugar weighs several hundred pounds, and it has to be rolled, lifted and positioned by teams of men working in coordination. The holds of ships are dark, cramped and dangerous, with poorly secured cargo that can shift without warning. Injuries are common and medical care is minimal. A man who breaks his leg on the docks does not receive workers' compensation, because workers' compensation does not exist yet. He receives a pat on the back and possibly the name of a doctor who will treat him on credit, and he hopes the leg heals well enough that he can come back to work before his family starves. The docks are organised and controlled by gangs. This is not an exaggeration or a simplification. The waterfront in New York has been gang territory since the mid-1800s, and by 1905 the power dynamics are deeply entrenched. Different gangs control different piers, different ethnic groups dominate different sections of the waterfront, and the violence that enforces these boundaries is casual and frequent. The Irish have historically dominated the West Side docks, and while this is beginning to shift as Italian immigrants move into the waterfront labour force, the transition is not peaceful. Fights, beatings, and occasionally killings are part of the landscape. The police are aware of the situation but largely uninvolved, partly because the waterfront is its own ecosystem, and partly because many officers are on the take from the same people who run the docks. You spend the day hauling cargo, and by mid-afternoon your back is screaming and your hands are raw. The pay for a day's work on the docks varies, but a longshoreman in 1905 can expect to earn between $2 and $4 for a full day, which is decent money if you can get it consistently. The problem is consistency. Work depends on which ships are in port, what cargo they carry, and whether the hiring boss likes you today as much as he liked you yesterday. Some weeks you work every day, some weeks you work 2 days. The unpredictability is itself a form of control. It keeps the workers desperate and compliant, which is exactly how the stevedoring companies and their hired bosses want it. Here is a detail about waterfront life that historians love to debate. The longshoremen's saloons, bars that clustered around every pier entrance like barnacles on a hull, served a function that went far beyond drinking. They were hiring halls, social clubs, money-lending operations, and political organising centres all rolled into one. A longshoreman who wanted work knew to be on good terms with the saloon keeper, who often had influence over the hiring boss. A man who needed a loan to cover rent until the next payday went to the saloon keeper. A man who wanted to vote the right way, and by the right way, I mean the way Tammany Hall wanted him to vote, received his instructions at the saloon. The saloon was the true centre of waterfront life, and the temperance reformers who wanted to shut them all down genuinely did not understand, or did not care, that they were proposing to dismantle the entire social infrastructure of the dock working class. There is a quirky and somewhat macabre detail about the waterfront that deserves mention. The rivers surrounding Manhattan were so polluted by industrial waste, sewage, and runoff that they were functionally dead in many stretches, and yet enterprising individuals made their living fishing the rivers and selling what they caught. The East River was home to a community of fishermen who pulled up eels, crabs, and various unidentifiable creatures from water that a modern environmental scientist would classify as toxic. These catches were sold in the markets and eaten by people who could not afford anything better. Whether this food was actually dangerous is a question that historians and scientists have debated. The human stomach is surprisingly resilient, but the contaminants in the water were genuinely serious. The fact that people ate the fish tells you everything you need to know about the hierarchy of concerns in 1905. Contamination is a problem for tomorrow. Hunger is a problem for right now. The afternoon shadows lengthen on the piers. The work slows. Ships are loaded or unloaded, hatches are closed, and the longshoremen drift away from the waterfront in small groups, heading for the saloons, heading for home, heading for wherever the evening takes them. Your body aches in places you did not know you had places. You have earned your money today. Tomorrow you will try to earn it again. But first, lunch. Because at some point during this grinding day, whether you work in a garment factory or on the docks or in any of the 1,000 other places that employ the working people of New York, you need to eat. And the way you eat lunch in 1905 is one of the great underappreciated pleasures and hazards of daily life. If you packed a lunch, and many workers do, you're eating whatever was left over from last night's dinner, wrapped in newspaper or stuffed into a tin pail. Cold potatoes, a chunk of bread and a piece of cheese, maybe a hard-boiled egg if the household can spare one. You eat at your station or on the curb outside the factory or sitting on a coil of rope at the edge of the pier, and you eat fast because your break is 30 minutes at best and the clock does not stop because you're still chewing. But if you are buying lunch, the streets of New York offer you an astonishing array of options, most of them cheap, many of them delicious, and a few of them genuinely questionable. The pushcart economy of the Lower East Side is a food court without walls, a sprawling, chaotic, open-air market that runs from early morning to late evening and offers something for every palate and every budget. The niche is everywhere. A niche, if you have never encountered one, is a pocket of dough filled with mashed potato, onion, or sometimes ground meat, baked or fried and sold hot from the cart. It costs a penny or two and it is filling, savoury, and perfectly designed for eating while walking. The niche vendors compete with each other fiercely, each claiming to make the best niche on the block, each calling out to passers-by with a pitch that combines salesmanship, theatre, and mild harassment. The knish will eventually become an iconic New York food, but right now it is just what you eat when you're hungry and have 3 cents. Hot dogs are sold from carts, though they are not yet universally called hot dogs. They are frankfurters or wieners, or red hots, depending on who is selling them and what neighbourhood you are in. Nathan Handwerker, who will eventually open the famous Nathan's Famous hot dog stand on Coney Island, is currently a young immigrant working at a restaurant in the city, still years away from his hot dog empire. But the frankfurter on a roll is already a staple of street food, sold for a few cents from steam carts positioned on busy corners. The oyster sellers are still a presence on the streets, though the great age of New York oysters is winding down. For most of the 19th century, New York Harbour was one of the richest oyster beds in the world, and oysters were the food of the poor, cheap, abundant, and sold raw on the half-shell from street stands for a penny apiece. By 1905, pollution and overharvesting have devastated the oyster beds, and the once limitless supply is shrinking. But you can still buy oysters on the street, and many people do, shucked to order and swallowed standing up, chased with a squeeze of lemon and a splash of vinegar if you are feeling fancy. The idea that oysters are a luxury food would strike any New Yorker of this era as hilarious. Oysters are what you eat when you cannot afford a real meal. Here is a mainstream historical fact about food culture in this period that contextualizes everything you're eating. The concept of food safety, as we understand it, is in its infancy. The Pure Food and Drug Act is still a year away from passage. Municipal health inspections of food vendors are sporadic and ineffective. The pushcart vendors operate without licenses in many cases, and the food preparation standards range from scrupulously clean to genuinely horrifying. Some vendors keep their products covered and fresh. Others display their wares on open carts in the street, exposed to dust, horse manure particles, and the unwashed hands of every customer who squeezes, pokes and prods before buying. The phrase, buyer beware, is not a legal concept here. It is a survival strategy. And yet, the food is often extraordinarily good. The immigrant communities of the Lower East Side brought their culinary traditions with them, and these traditions collide and cross-pollinate on the streets of New York in ways that will eventually define American food culture. Jewish delis are emerging as institutions, with their pastrami, corned beef, and towering sandwich architecture. Italian bakeries are producing bread and pastries that rival anything in Naples. Chinese restaurants in the small but growing Chinatown district are introducing dishes that most New Yorkers have never encountered. The food of the city is a living document, rewritten daily by every new arrival who sets up a pushcart or opens a storefront. There is a quirky detail about lunchtime culture on the Lower East Side that captures something essential about the neighbourhood: the penny restaurant. These are tiny, no-frills eating establishments, sometimes just a room with a counter and a few stools, that serve simple meals for a few cents. A bowl of soup, a penny, a plate of beans, 2 cents, a cup of coffee, a penny. They cater to the poorest workers, the ones who cannot even afford a pushcart knish, and they operate on margins so thin that a slow day can mean the difference between keeping the doors open and closing. The food is basic: soups, stews, bread, but it is hot and filling, and for a worker who has been on their feet since 6 in the morning, a hot bowl of soup at midday is a small miracle. You eat your lunch, whatever it is, and you wash it down with water from a public fountain or a cup of coffee from a vendor. The half-hour break flies by. Around you, the street continues its ceaseless performance. The vendors, the horses, the children, the noise. A man with an organ grinder and a monkey is entertaining a small crowd on the corner. Someone is arguing with a pushcart vendor about the price of a pair of suspenders. Two women are exchanging gossip across an airshaft, their voices carrying clearly in the narrow canyon between buildings. You wipe your hands on your trousers, take a last breath of relatively fresh air, and head back inside. The afternoon shift is waiting. While you are back at your machine or your cargo hook, there are children on the streets of New York who are not in school. This is not an exception or an anomaly. This is, for a significant portion of the city's youth, simply the way things are. New York State has a compulsory education law on the books. Children are supposed to attend school until the age of 14, but the gap between the law as written and the law as enforced is wide enough to drive a horse-drawn wagon through, and many families do exactly that, sending their children to work instead of school because the family needs the income more than it needs the education. The truant officers who are supposed to enforce attendance do their best, but they are understaffed, underpaid, and working against economic forces that are far more powerful than a bureaucratic mandate. The newsboys are the most visible of the child workers, and in 1905 they are an institution unto themselves. These are boys, and some girls, though the girls are less common, ranging in age from about 7 to 15, who buy newspapers in bulk from the publishing houses and sell them on street corners for a small profit. They buy the papers for a fraction of a cent each and sell them for a penny, keeping the difference. The work requires speed, a loud voice, and the ability to navigate the city without getting robbed, run over or arrested. The best spots, the busy intersections, the subway entrances, the theatre districts, are controlled by informal hierarchies of older boys who do not take kindly to newcomers. The newsboys' strike of 1899, just 6 years ago, is still fresh in memory. When Joseph Pulitzer's New York World and William Randolph Hearst's New York Journal raised the wholesale price of papers, the newsboys organised and struck, refusing to sell either paper until the price was reduced. The strike lasted about 2 weeks and was partially successful, becoming one of the earliest examples of child workers organising for better conditions. It also demonstrated something that the rest of the labour movement was beginning to understand. Collective action works, even when the workers are 12 years old and have no union, no treasury, and no political connections. They had solidarity and stubbornness, and that turned out to be enough. But newsboys are only the tip of the iceberg. Children in New York in 1905 work in factories and workshops, in domestic service, and on the streets in dozens of capacities. Boys black boots on street corners, run errands for shops, carry messages for businesses, and work as helpers in every trade from butchery to carpentry. Girls work in garment shops, in laundries, in artificial flower factories, an industry that employs thousands of women and children in conditions that would not pass inspection in a modern kindergarten, let alone a workplace. The work involves assembling fake flowers from wire, paper and fabric, using paste and dyes that are often toxic. The pay is a few cents per gross of flowers, and a fast worker, including children as young as 8, can produce several gross per day. Here is a detail about child labour in this era that is both heartbreaking and instructive. The photographer Lewis Hine has not yet begun his famous documentation of child labour. That work will start in about 1908 when he goes to work for the National Child Labour Committee. But the conditions he will photograph already exist in full. Children working in coal mines, in textile mills, in canneries, in street trades. When Hine's photographs are eventually published, they will shock the nation and contribute to the reform movement. But right now, in 1905, the children are invisible in the way that familiar suffering is always invisible. People see them every day and do not see them at all. The schools that do exist for the children of the poor are overcrowded, underfunded and struggling. The public schools of the Lower East Side operate in buildings that were designed for half the students they now serve. Classes of 50 or 60 children are common. Teachers are overworked and underpaid. The curriculum is focused heavily on Americanization, teaching English, American history, and American values to the children of immigrants, and while this serves a genuine social function, it also creates tensions with families who want their children to maintain their cultural and religious identities. Many Jewish families send their sons to cheder, religious school, in addition to, or instead of public school. adding another layer of educational obligation to an already exhausting day. Historians still argue whether the public school system of this era was primarily a tool of genuine uplift, or primarily a mechanism of social control designed to turn immigrant children into compliant American workers. The answer, as with many things in this period, is probably both, in varying proportions depending on the school, the teacher, and the neighbourhood. There is a quirky fact about children's lives in 1905 New York that offers a small window of light amid the grimness. The settlement houses, community centres run by reform-minded middle-class women and men, provide programs for children that include art classes, music lessons, libraries, playgrounds, and clubs. The most famous of these is the Henry Street Settlement, founded by Lillian Wald on the Lower East Side, which offers everything from nursing care to dramatic performances. For many children, the settlement house is the one place in their lives that is safe, warm, and oriented towards something other than survival. The idea that a child might draw a picture or sing a song simply for the pleasure of it is revolutionary in a world where every waking hour is otherwise devoted to earning or saving pennies. You hear the newsboys calling outside the factory window, their voices rising above the clatter of the machines. The headlines today are about politics, or crime, or a fire somewhere, or the latest scandal from Tammany Hall. The children's voices are high and clear and slightly hoarse from a day of shouting. They will keep selling until the papers are gone or the light fails, whichever comes first. Then they will go home, or they will go wherever home is, which for some of them is a lodging house, and for others is a doorway or a warm grate. The city is not sentimental about its children, but some of its people are, and they are beginning to organise, to document, to demand. Change is coming, just not fast enough for the boy on the corner who is selling his last paper in the gathering dark. Speaking of gathering, right now, at this very moment, while you sit at your sewing machine or haul your cargo or hawk your newspapers, a ship is pulling into New York Harbour carrying several hundred people who are about to have the most terrifying and transformative day of their lives. They are immigrants, and they are headed for Ellis Island. Ellis Island in 1905 is processing immigrants at a rate that is difficult to comprehend. In this single year, more than 1 million people will pass through its doors, the highest annual total in the island's history. 1 million. That is roughly 3,000 people per day, every day for the entire year. They come from Italy, from Russia, from Poland, from Austria-Hungary, from Greece, from Syria, from every corner of Europe and beyond. They come in the steerage compartments of steamships, where they have spent 1 to 3 weeks in conditions that make the tenements look spacious. They come carrying bundles, suitcases, trunks, and occasionally nothing at all. They come because life where they were was worse than the uncertainty of where they are going, and that calculation tells you everything you need to know about what they left behind. The ship enters the harbour and the immigrants get their first look at the Statue of Liberty, which has been standing on Bedloes Island since 1886. The statue is less than 20 years old, and it is already the most famous symbol of America in the world. The immigrants crowd the rails of the ship to see it, and by many accounts the emotional response is overwhelming. People cry, people pray, people stand in silence and stare. The statue represents a promise, and whether that promise will be kept is a question that each of them will answer individually over the coming years. The ship docks, and the first and second class passengers are processed on board and released into the city with minimal fuss. It is the steerage passengers, the poor ones, the ones who paid the lowest fares and travelled in the worst conditions, who are ferried to Ellis Island for inspection. This is not a coincidence. The immigration process is designed, quite explicitly, to filter the poor. The assumption is that wealthy immigrants are desirable and poor immigrants are potentially problematic, and the inspection process reflects this assumption at every step. At Ellis Island, the immigrants enter the main building, a massive red brick structure with a registry room on the second floor that is one of the largest interior spaces in America. They climb the stairs carrying their baggage, and doctors watch them climb, looking for signs of physical disability, lameness, or shortness of breath. This is the first medical screening, and it is happening before you even know you're being screened. At the top of the stairs, you enter the registry room and join one of the lines that snake between metal railings. A doctor examines you briefly, checking your eyes, your throat, your hands, your scalp. He is looking for trachoma, a contagious eye disease that is an automatic basis for deportation. He is looking for favus, a fungal infection of the scalp. He is looking for any sign of mental illness, physical deformity, or contagious disease. The examination takes about 6 seconds per person, and in those 6 seconds a doctor decides whether your American dream continues or ends. If you pass the medical exam, you proceed to the legal inspection, where an interpreter asks you a series of questions: your name, your age, your occupation, where you're going, who's meeting you, how much money you have, do you have a job waiting for you. That last question is a trap. If you say yes, you can be excluded under the Alien Contract Labour Law, which prohibits importing workers under prearranged contracts. If you say no, you might be excluded as likely to become a public charge. The correct answer, which experienced immigrants pass along through networks of advice, is that you have prospects but nothing arranged. It is a dance of words, and the stakes could not be higher. Here is a fact that surprises many people. The vast majority of immigrants who arrive at Ellis Island are admitted. The rejection rate is only about 2%. 98% of the people who walk into that building walk out the other side into America. But 2% of a million is still 20,000 people, and for those 20,000 the experience is devastating. To be turned away after weeks of travel, after selling everything you own, after saying goodbye to everyone you know, after enduring the misery of steerage, to be told at the door that you are not wanted, is a cruelty that breaks people. Ellis Island earns the nickname the Island of Tears not because of what happens to the majority, but because of what happens to the few. Historians still argue whether the Ellis Island process was fundamentally fair or fundamentally discriminatory. The evidence supports both interpretations. The inspectors were generally professional, and many were genuinely sympathetic, but the system was designed to exclude people with disabilities, people with certain diseases, people deemed mentally deficient, a category so vague it was applied arbitrarily, and people who were simply too poor. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 has already closed the door to most Chinese immigrants, and broader restrictions are coming. The Immigration Act of 1907 and eventually the quota laws of the 1920s will fundamentally reshape who is allowed in. But in 1905, the door is still relatively open, and the flood of humanity pouring through it is reshaping the city day by day. There is a small, human detail about Ellis Island that I find particularly moving. The island had a room called the Kissing Post, an area just past the final inspection point where approved immigrants reunited with family members who had come to meet them. The scenes at the Kissing Post were, by all accounts, extraordinary. Husbands and wives separated for years, parents meeting children they had sent money to bring over, brothers and sisters who had not seen each other since one of them left the old country. The tears, the embraces, the sheer volume of emotion concentrated in that one small space was something that even the most jaded immigration officials found affecting. The newly approved immigrants step onto the ferry that will carry them from Ellis Island to the Battery at the southern tip of Manhattan. They step off the ferry and into the city. They are Americans now, or at least they are in America, which is not quite the same thing but is close enough for the moment. They carry their bundles into the streets, blinking in the unfamiliar light, and they begin the process of finding their way to a cousin's apartment or a boarding house, or a familiar face in the crowd. And the crowd absorbs them, as it absorbs everyone. The city is insatiable. Where these new arrivals end up depends largely on where they came from, because New York in 1905 is not a melting pot so much as a mosaic. The neighbourhoods are sharply defined by ethnicity, language and religion, each one a world within the world, with its own customs, its own economy, its own newspapers, and its own unwritten rules. You walk south from the tenements of the Jewish Lower East Side, where Yiddish is the dominant language, and the streets are lined with kosher butchers, synagogues, and Yiddish theatres, and within a few blocks you cross an invisible border into Little Italy. The transition is marked not by a sign or a gate, but by a sudden change in everything. The language on the street shifts from Yiddish to Italian, the dialects varying block by block, Neapolitan here, Sicilian there, Calabrese around the corner. The pushcarts now sell different goods: provolone cheese, soppressata, dried pasta, olive oil in tin cans. The bakeries display different bread. The smells from the apartment windows are different. Even the way people move through the street is different, and if you have spent enough time in the neighbourhood, you can tell which block you're on with your eyes closed just by listening and breathing. Little Italy in 1905 centres on Mulberry Street, and it is a place of tremendous vitality and tremendous hardship. The Italian immigrants who live here are mostly from southern Italy and Sicily, And they have come to New York for the same reasons everyone else has. Because life at home offered nothing, and life here offers at least the possibility of something. Many of the men work in construction, digging the tunnels and laying the tracks for the expanding subway system, or in the building trades, or on the docks. The women do piecework at home or in small shops, and the family economy depends on everyone contributing. The Italians, like the Jews, like the Irish before them, are building community from scratch, creating mutual aid societies, social clubs, and religious organisations that serve as a safety net in a city that offers none. Farther south and east you reach Chinatown, which in 1905 is tiny, just a few blocks centred on Mott Street and Pell Street, but dense with significance. The Chinese community in New York is small, perhaps 6,000 or 7,000 people, hemmed in by the Chinese Exclusion Act that has throttled immigration from China since 1882. The community is overwhelmingly male, because the exclusion laws prevent most Chinese women from entering the country, creating a bachelor society that is isolated, insular, and the subject of intense fascination and suspicion from the rest of the city. Chinatown's restaurants are already drawing adventurous eaters from other neighbourhoods. Chop suey is the dish of the moment, wildly popular among non-Chinese New Yorkers who consider it exotic. Historians still argue whether chop suey is an authentically Chinese dish, adapted for American tastes, or an entirely American invention marketed as Chinese. The evidence suggests it is somewhere in between, like most things that emerge from cultural collision. The Irish, who were the dominant immigrant group of the previous generation, have by 1905 moved up and out in many ways. They are no longer the newest arrivals, no longer the most desperately poor, and they have leveraged their numbers and their English language advantage into political power. The Irish run Tammany Hall, the democratic political machine that effectively controls the city government. Irish cops walk the beat. Irish foremen run the construction sites. Irish bartenders pour the drinks. This does not mean that all Irish New Yorkers are prosperous. Plenty still live in poverty. But as a community, the Irish have achieved a foothold that the newer immigrants are still scrambling for. Other communities are scattered through the city in pockets and clusters. German immigrants, who were once the largest foreign-born group in the city, are concentrated in the Kleindeutschland neighbourhood on the east side, though the community was devastated by the General Slocum disaster just last year, a steamship fire on the East River that killed more than 1,000 people, most of them German-American women and children on a church outing. The disaster was the deadliest in New York City's history until September 11th, 2001, and it effectively destroyed the Kleindeutschland community. Many surviving families moved uptown to Yorkville or out to the boroughs, unable to remain in a neighbourhood haunted by so much loss. There are Greek immigrants in certain blocks, Syrian immigrants in others, Hungarian, Romanian, Polish, each group carving out a small territory and building the institutions of community life. The diversity is staggering, and the interactions between these communities range from cooperative to hostile. Ethnic tensions are real and sometimes violent. Competition for jobs, for housing, for the limited resources of the neighbourhood creates friction that flares into confrontation. And yet, the communities also depend on each other in ways that are less visible but equally real. The Jewish garment manufacturer buys his lunch from the Italian pushcart vendor. The Irish cop walks his beat through Chinatown. The German baker sells bread to everyone. The city works because it has to, because the alternative to coexistence in this density is chaos. There is a detail about the linguistic landscape of the city that captures the Babel beautifully. In 1905, there are newspapers published in New York in at least a dozen languages. The Yiddish Daily Forward has a circulation that rivals the English language papers. There are Italian papers, German papers, Chinese papers, Greek papers, Arabic papers. There are political papers, religious papers, literary papers, and gossip papers, all published in the languages of the communities they serve. For many immigrants, these papers are the primary source of news, guidance, and connection to both the old world and the new. They publish advice columns for newcomers, serialized novels, political commentary, and advertisements for everything from steamship tickets to patent medicine. The newsstand on the corner of your block is a miniature United Nations, its racks displaying a kaleidoscope of scripts and languages that captures, in ink and paper, the astonishing diversity of the city itself. You walk through these neighbourhoods and you feel the boundaries are subtle but unmistakable. You know where you belong and where you do not, And yet, the boundaries shift. A family moves, a shop opens, a marriage crosses a line, the map is redrawn daily and nobody has the final version. Now, in the middle of all this living, there is also a tremendous amount of dying, and you need to understand just how close death is at all times in 1905 New York. Death is not an abstraction here. It is not something that happens in hospitals to old people. It is present in your building, on your block, in your family, and it comes for you in forms that a modern person has largely forgotten exist. Tuberculosis is the great killer. They call it consumption because it seems to consume the body from the inside, and it is everywhere. New York City has one of the highest tuberculosis rates in the world, and the disease thrives in exactly the conditions that define tenement life: overcrowding, poor ventilation, inadequate nutrition, and stress. The man upstairs whose cough has been getting worse for weeks, you remember him from when you first woke up this morning. He almost certainly has it. Tuberculosis is spread through the air, through coughing and breathing, and in a tenement where rooms have no windows and families sleep 4 to a bed, the bacteria pass from person to person with terrifying efficiency. There is no cure. There will not be an effective antibiotic treatment until streptomycin in the 1940s. In 1905, tuberculosis treatment consists primarily of fresh air, rest, and nutrition, all things that are effectively unavailable to the poor. Sanatoriums exist upstate, where patients are sent to breathe clean mountain air and lie in the sun, but these are for people with money or connections. For the residents of the Lower East Side, tuberculosis is a death sentence that takes months or years to carry out, slowly hollowing out the victim while everyone around them watches and waits, and tries not to breathe too deeply. The Board of Health knows that tuberculosis is a crisis. The city has launched campaigns to educate the public about hygiene. Do not spit on the floor, cover your mouth when you cough, open your windows. Anti-spitting ordinances are passed and signs are posted in public buildings. But these measures are fighting against the reality of tenement life, where following the rules is often physically impossible. How do you open a window for ventilation when your window faces an air shaft full of garbage? How do you isolate a sick family member when your entire family lives in one room? Beyond tuberculosis, the disease landscape of 1905 New York reads like a catalogue of horrors. Typhoid fever, spread through contaminated water and food, kills hundreds each year. Diphtheria, a bacterial infection that can close the throat and suffocate its victims, is a particular terror for children. Scarlet fever, measles, whooping cough. All of these are common and all of them are deadly, especially for the malnourished children of the tenements. Smallpox outbreaks still occur, though vaccination is available and increasingly required. Cholera, the great epidemic disease of the previous century, is less of a threat thanks to improvements in the water supply, but the fear of it lingers. The infant mortality rate is perhaps the most damning statistic of all. In some Lower East Side neighbourhoods, roughly 1 in 4 children dies before reaching the age of 5. Let that number sit with you. 1 in 4. If you have 4 children, you expect to bury one of them. This is the mathematics of poverty and disease, calculated in the smallest bodies, and it is one of the driving forces behind the reform movements that are beginning to gain momentum. Medical care, when it exists, is primitive by modern standards. Doctors make house calls, and many of them are skilled and dedicated, but the tools available to them are limited. Antibiotics do not exist. Surgical antisepsis is practiced but not universal. Anesthesia for surgery is available but carries its own risks. Many of the medications sold over the counter are patent medicines, unregulated concoctions that contain everything from alcohol to opium to mercury and treat nothing effectively. Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, a popular remedy for teething children, contains morphine. Heroin is marketed by the biopharmaceutical company as a cough suppressant. The pharmaceutical landscape is, from a modern perspective, genuinely insane. Historians still argue whether the public health improvements of this era were primarily driven by scientific understanding or by political and economic pressure from the middle and upper classes who feared that disease would spread from the tenements into their own neighbourhoods. The truth, as usual, is complicated. Genuine altruism exists alongside enlightened self-interest, alongside plain old bigotry, and the public health campaigns of the early 1900s reflect all 3 motivations. Here is a small but telling detail about death and dying in the tenements. When someone died, and remember, this happened frequently, the body was laid out in the apartment. There were no funeral homes as we know them. The body was washed and dressed by family members, placed on a board or a table, and mourned in the same room where the family ate and slept. Candles were lit. Mirrors were covered. Neighbours came to pay respects. The wake might last a day or two, depending on the tradition, and during that time the body was simply there, in the apartment, while life continued around it. Children played, meals were prepared. The boundaries between life and death were, by modern standards, startlingly thin. You are alive today. That is not a guarantee for tomorrow. But you go on living because that is what you do in New York in 1905. You go on. And as you go on living, you keep smelling things. It is worth pausing to give the full sensory picture of this city, because the smell of New York in 1905 is something that a modern person genuinely cannot imagine. You think you know what a city smells like? You do not. Not this city, not this year. Start with the horses, because we keep coming back to the horses. 130,000 of them, each producing between 15 and 30 pounds of manure and about a quart of urine per day. That is somewhere in the neighbourhood of 2.5 million pounds of horse manure deposited on the streets of New York every single day. The city's Department of Street Cleaning fights a losing battle against this tide, employing thousands of sweepers who push the manure to the gutters, where it is theoretically collected by wagons and carried away. In practice, the manure accumulates faster than it can be removed, especially in the poorer neighbourhoods where city services are least reliable. In summer, the manure bakes in the sun and creates a miasma that hangs over the streets like an invisible fog. In winter, it freezes into icy mounds. In rain, it becomes a brown slurry that coats everything below knee level. But the horses are just the beginning. Layer on top of the manure the smell of garbage. Household waste in the tenement districts is collected irregularly and disposed of imperfectly. Kitchen scraps, ashes from coal stoves, broken objects, and refuse of every description pile up in the streets, in vacant lots, and in the alleyways between buildings. Rats thrive in this environment. The rat population of New York in this era is estimated at several million, and they are bold, numerous, and omnipresent. The smell of rotting garbage, combined with the smell of the rats themselves, is a constant undercurrent in the olfactory experience of the city. The industrial smells add another dimension. The slaughterhouses that still operate in Manhattan, mostly on the west side near the Hudson River, produce a smell that defies description. Blood, offal, and rendering fats combine to create an aroma that can be detected blocks away, and that makes even hardened New Yorkers gag when the wind shifts. The tanneries, where animal hides are processed into leather, using chemicals including urine and animal brains, contribute their own signature scent. The gasworks, the breweries, the chemical plants, the coal smoke from every stove and furnace, each adds a note to the symphony of stench. The human element cannot be overlooked. In neighbourhoods where hundreds of thousands of people are packed into a few square miles, many of them without adequate access to bathing facilities, the smell of human bodies is simply part of the atmosphere. This is not a moral judgment. These are people working 12-hour days at hard physical labour, living in apartments without running hot water, and doing the best they can with the resources available. But the reality is that the ambient scent of a crowded tenement hallway on a summer afternoon is something that would knock a modern person flat. And then there is the sewage. New York's sewer system is under construction, has been for decades, and is far from complete. Some neighbourhoods have modern sewers connected to treatment facilities, others still rely on cesspools, privies, and open drainage. The system is overtaxed even where it exists, and sewage backups are common. When it rains heavily, the combined sewer system, which handles both stormwater and sewage, overflows directly into the rivers. The rivers themselves, as mentioned earlier, are essentially open sewers by this point, receiving the waste of millions of people and hundreds of industrial operations. On a hot day, standing on a pier by the East River, you can smell the water. It is not a pleasant smell. Here is a quirky detail about the olfactory life of the city that reveals both the horror and the humour of the situation. Wealthy New Yorkers who ventured into the tenement districts for charitable or reform purposes often reported being physically overwhelmed by the smell. One reformer described the experience of entering a rear tenement as being hit by a wall of odour so dense it felt solid. But the residents themselves, in interviews and memoirs, rarely mention the smell as a primary concern. They mention the rent, they mention the work, they mention the diseases, they mention the cold. The smell, apparently, was so constant and so universal that it had become invisible. or rather, imperceptible. It was simply what the world smelled like, and complaining about it was as pointless as complaining about gravity. Historians still argue whether the sanitation reforms of the early 20th century, the expansion of the sewer system, the replacement of horses with automobiles, the establishment of regular garbage collection, were motivated primarily by public health concerns or by the aesthetic sensibilities of the upper classes, who found the smell of the poor neighbourhoods intolerable. The answer once again involves both motivations, tangled together in the messy way that social progress always involves a mixture of idealism and self-interest. The irony, which no one in 1905 can appreciate yet, is that the automobile, which is just beginning to appear on the streets and which will eventually solve the horse manure problem, will create an entirely new set of environmental horrors. But that is a story for another century. Right now, you step over the horse droppings, hold your breath past the garbage pile and keep walking. The city smells terrible, and you have stopped noticing. If the smell is the invisible infrastructure of the city, the corruption is the invisible government. Because the official government of New York, the mayor, the city council, the various departments and agencies, is, in 1905, largely controlled by an organisation that is not mentioned in any charter or constitution. That organisation is Tammany Hall. Tammany Hall is the Democratic Party political machine that has dominated New York City politics for most of the previous half-century. It is named after its headquarters, a building on 14th Street, and it operates through a network of ward bosses, district leaders, precinct captains, and street-level operatives who together form the most effective political organisation in America. Tammany's power is built on a simple transaction. It provides services to the poor, jobs, food, coal in winter, help navigating the legal system, bail money, funeral expenses, and in exchange, the poor vote the way Tammany tells them to. It is patronage politics at its most refined, and it works because it meets real needs that no one else is meeting. The current boss of Tammany Hall is Charles Francis Murphy, who took over after the fall of Richard Croker a few years earlier. Murphy is quieter and more disciplined than his predecessor. He's sometimes called Silent Charlie because of his preference for listening over talking, but he's no less effective. Under Murphy, Tammany controls the police department, the fire department, the public works department, and most of the city's patronage jobs. If you want a job as a city employee, a cop, a clerk, a sanitation worker, you go to your ward boss, and the ward boss delivers. If you want a building permit, a liquor license, or a blind eye turned to some code violation, you go to your ward boss, and the ward boss arranges it. Nothing happens in the city without Tammany's knowledge, and usually Tammany's permission. The police department is where the corruption is most visible and most consequential. Cops in New York in 1905 are not civil servants selected by merit. They are political appointees, placed on the force by Tammany ward bosses, and their primary loyalty is not to the law, but to the organisation that gave them their badge. A beat cop is expected to collect payments from the saloons, brothels, gambling establishments, and illegal businesses on his route and pass a portion upward through the chain of command. This is not occasional or secret. It is systematic, institutionalised, and understood by everyone involved. The Lexo Committee investigations of the 1890s expose the depth of police corruption in spectacular detail, and while some reforms followed, the fundamental system remains intact in 1905. If you're a law-abiding resident of the tenement districts, the police are an ambiguous presence. They might help you, they might rob you, they might beat you. The outcome depends on factors including your ethnicity, your neighbourhood, your connections, and the particular officer's mood. The police use force freely and without much oversight. Nightsticks are applied to heads with a casualness that would generate lawsuits and investigations in a modern city. Arrests are made on pretexts, and the line between arrest and extortion is blurred. If a cop picks you up for vagrancy or public drunkenness, you might end up in the Tombs, the city's detention centre, officially called the Halls of Justice, a building so grim that its nickname is used without irony, and you might stay there until someone pays to get you out. The relationship between Tammany Hall and the immigrant communities is particularly interesting, and historians still argue about how to characterise it. On one hand, Tammany exploits the immigrants, using their votes and their vulnerability. On the other hand, Tammany provides services that no government agency bothers to offer. When a family is evicted, the ward boss finds them a new apartment. When a man is arrested, the ward boss arranges bail. When someone dies, the ward boss sends flowers and money. These services are real, and they create a bond of loyalty that reformers, with their abstract talk of good government and merit-based hiring, cannot match. Here is a detail about Tammany's operations that captures the system beautifully. Ward bosses maintained what they called a social calendar, a record of every wedding, funeral, christening, and bar mitzvah in their district. They attended these events personally, bringing gifts and offering condolences or congratulations. They remembered names, asked about sick relatives, followed up on problems. It was, in its way, a remarkably sophisticated form of constituent service, and it worked because it was personal, immediate, and tangible. The reformer who promises better city services in 6 months cannot compete with the ward boss, who shows up at your daughter's wedding with an envelope of cash today. The corruption costs the city enormously, of course. Public works contracts are inflated. City jobs are filled by the unqualified. Services are distributed not by need, but by political loyalty. The infrastructure suffers, the schools suffer, the poorest neighbourhoods suffer most. But for the individual immigrant family trying to survive, the calculation is different. You vote for Tammany because Tammany feeds you. The abstraction of good government is no match for the reality of the ward boss at your door. You pass a cop on the corner, he nods at you, or he does not. You keep walking. As the day wears on and the sun begins its descent toward the Hudson, a different New York emerges. The New York of daylight is one thing: crowded, industrious, sweaty, and purposeful. The New York of nighttime is something else entirely, and in the neighbourhoods clustered around the Tenderloin district, the after-dark city is alive with pleasures and dangers that the daytime city pretends do not exist. The Tenderloin is a stretch of midtown Manhattan, roughly between 23rd Street and 42nd Street, west of Broadway. It gets its name from a police captain named Alexander Williams, who, upon being transferred to the district in the 1870s, reportedly said, "I've been having chuck steak ever since I've been on the force, and now I'm going to have a bit of tenderloin." What he meant was that the district was so rich in graft, the payoffs from saloons, gambling houses, and houses of prostitution, that policing it was like being handed the choicest cut of meat. The name stuck, and by 1905 the Tenderloin is both a neighbourhood and a concept, shorthand for everything that is exciting and sinful about New York at night. Saloons are the most common nighttime establishment in the city, and by most counts there are more than 10,000 of them in 1905, roughly one for every 400 residents. The saloon is not just a place to drink. It is a social institution that serves many of the same functions as the longshoremen's saloons down at the waterfront: a meeting place, an information exchange, a lending institution, a political club, and occasionally a place to sleep when you have nowhere else to go. Saloons range from ornate establishments, with carved mahogany bars and brass fixtures, to backroom operations where the whiskey might be cut with anything from water to turpentine. The beer is generally safe. Breweries are among the more regulated food producers of the era, but the hard liquor is a gamble. Beyond the saloons, the Tenderloin offers dance halls, concert saloons, music halls, and establishments that operate under the deliberately vague category of entertainment. Dance halls are wildly popular among young working-class women and men, and they are the source of intense anxiety among reformers who see them as breeding grounds for immorality. The concern is not entirely baseless. The dance halls do facilitate contact between young men and women in an era when such contact is heavily regulated by custom and community. But the reformers' tendency to see corruption and vice behind every polka is somewhat overwrought. Most people at the dance halls are simply dancing, which in 1905 is considered a mildly scandalous activity if done with a stranger, and a perfectly innocent one if done with a chaperone. The chaperones, however, have a tendency to look the other way. Gambling is everywhere. It is illegal technically, but so widely practiced that the distinction between legal and illegal entertainment is mostly theoretical. Card games run in back rooms of saloons, in private clubs, and in dedicated gambling houses that pay regular bribes to the police for the privilege of operating. Pool halls double as gambling venues. Horse racing is enormously popular, and the betting industry that surrounds it is vast and largely unregulated. Policy, a form of numbers game that is the forerunner of the modern lottery, is run out of shops and candy stores throughout the poorer neighbourhoods, with customers betting pennies on number combinations and dreaming of payoffs that rarely come. Prostitution is the great unmentionable and the great unavoidable. Red light districts exist throughout the city, concentrated in the Tenderloin but present in virtually every neighbourhood. Reformers estimate that there are tens of thousands of women working in prostitution in New York in this period, though the exact numbers are, for obvious reasons, impossible to verify. Some women work in brothels, called houses, that range from expensive establishments catering to the wealthy to miserable rooms in tenement basements. Others work the streets. The economics of prostitution are straightforward and grim. A woman who cannot find other work, or who cannot earn enough at other work, or who has been brought into the trade through coercion or desperation, turns to the one commodity she can sell. The city pretends to be shocked while profiting at every level. Landlords collect rent from brothels, police collect bribes, and the political machine collects votes and loyalty. Here is a detail about nightlife in this era that reveals the strange complexity of the city's entertainment culture. Concert saloons, establishments that offered food, drink, and live entertainment, were the forerunners of both vaudeville and the modern nightclub. They ranged from rough establishments where the entertainment was secondary to the drinking, to genuinely impressive venues with staged musical performances, comedy acts, and variety shows. The audience sat at tables, ordered drinks, and watched the show, a format that feels remarkably modern. Some concert saloons were racially integrated, which was unusual in 1905, and which attracted both fascination and condemnation from observers. Historians still argue whether the Tenderloin era of New York nightlife was primarily a story of exploitation and vice, or primarily a story of cultural creativity and social freedom. The truth, as always, is that it was both simultaneously, a place where people were exploited and a place where people were free, where the rules of daytime society were suspended and other rules, not necessarily better, but undeniably different, took their place. The night gets darker. The gaslight and the new electric lamps create pools of light on the sidewalks, with stretches of shadow between them. You walk through the city's nighttime landscape and it feels different from the daytime city, as if the buildings have shifted slightly, and the streets have rearranged themselves into a new configuration. The noise is different. Less industrial, more human. Laughter from a saloon, music from a dance hall, the clip-clop of a horse-drawn cab. The night has its own rhythm, slower and stranger, and you move through it with a heightened awareness because the dark is where the rules bend. But let us step back from the saloons and the streets and into the apartment, because there is a person here whose story we have not fully told, and she deserves more than a passing mention. She is the woman of the household, your wife, your mother, your sister, your aunt, and her daily life in 1905. New York is a feat of endurance that makes the factory shift look simple. She has been up since before dawn. Remember the coal stove that was already going when you woke up? She started it. The water in the basin you washed with, she carried it. The bread and coffee you ate for breakfast, she prepared them. By the time you leave for work, she's already been labouring for an hour or more, and her workday will not end until long after yours does, because her workplace is the apartment, and the apartment never closes. The domestic labour of a tenement household in this era is staggering in its scope and its physical demands. Cooking on a coal stove requires constant attention, feeding the fire, adjusting the dampers, managing the heat. There is no thermostat, no timer, no automatic anything. You cook by feel and by experience, and a moment's inattention can ruin a meal or start a fire. The meals themselves have to be prepared from scratch, because there are no convenience foods in the modern sense. No canned soup, no frozen dinners, no pre-made anything. If you want to eat chicken for dinner, someone has to buy the chicken, possibly alive from a vendor who keeps them in crates on the sidewalk. Kill it, pluck it, clean it, and cook it. This takes hours. Shopping for food is a daily necessity because there is no reliable refrigeration. Every morning or every afternoon, someone, usually the woman, goes to the pushcarts and shops to buy what the family will eat that day. This involves navigating the crowded streets, bargaining with vendors, inspecting produce for freshness, and carrying everything back up 5 flights of stairs. A week's groceries for a family of 5 might include several loaves of bread, a few pounds of potatoes, some onions, herring, maybe a small piece of meat, eggs if the budget allows, and milk for the children if any can be obtained safely. The cleaning is relentless. The apartment accumulates coal dust from the stove, fabric lint if anyone is doing piecework at home, general grime from the streets tracked in on shoes, and whatever the airshaft sends through the window. Cleaning is done with a broom, a mop, rags, and water carried from the hallway tap. The floors are scrubbed on hands and knees. The stove is blacked with stove polish, a messy and toxic process. Laundry, as we discussed earlier, is an all-day affair involving washtub, washboard and more water carried up the stairs. And on top of all this domestic labour, many women in the tenements also do paid work. Piecework, taking in sewing, rolling cigars, making artificial flowers, finishing garments, is done at the kitchen table, in the same room where the children play and the family eats. A woman doing piecework at home might earn a few dollars a week, working in the gaps between cooking, cleaning and childcare. The hours are effectively all of them. There is no boundary between work and home because they occupy the same space. Children are underfoot constantly, and childcare in the modern sense does not exist. The older children watch the younger children, and everyone watches out for the babies. Infant mortality is high, as we have discussed, and the anxiety of keeping children alive in an environment full of hazards, open fires, steep staircases, street traffic, contaminated milk, disease, is a constant low hum of worry that never entirely subsides. Here is a mainstream historical fact that frames everything about women's lives in this period. Women cannot vote. The 19th Amendment is still 15 years away, and in 1905 the suffrage movement, while active and growing, has not yet achieved its goal. Women have limited legal rights regarding property, employment and their own children. A married woman's earnings technically belong to her husband in many legal contexts. Divorce is extremely difficult to obtain and carries enormous social stigma. The legal system treats women as dependents, and the cultural expectations are even more restrictive than the laws. And yet, the women of the tenements are not passive. They are organising, agitating and building the foundations of movements that will reshape the nation. The women's suffrage movement draws supporters from every class and ethnicity. The garment workers, many of them young women, are forming unions and preparing for the strikes that will define the next decade of labour history. Settlement house workers like Lillian Wald and Jane Addams are demonstrating that women can lead institutions and drive social change. The energy is building, even if the victories are still in the future. Historians still argue whether the women of this era should be understood primarily as victims of oppressive systems or as agents of their own liberation. The answer, of course, is that they are both, simultaneously, constrained by systems they did not create, and actively working to dismantle those systems, managing impossible workloads while imagining a world where the work might be shared more fairly. There is a small, telling detail about women's lives in the tenements that I think about often. Many women kept a jar of coins hidden somewhere in the apartment, under a floorboard, behind a loose brick, in the back of a cabinet. Money that was technically theirs but that they did not declare to their husbands or to the household budget. It was insurance against the worst case: abandonment, violence, eviction. A tiny fund of independence in a world that offered women almost none. The hidden jar of coins is not a historical footnote. It is a statement of intent. She finishes the dishes, wipes her hands, checks on the children, and sits down at the kitchen table to do another hour of piecework before bed. The needle moves, the thread pulls, the coins in the jar accumulate one by one. Now, while the woman at the kitchen table counts her hidden coins, let us travel about 60 blocks north, because there is another version of New York in 1905, and the contrast is so extreme, it feels like travelling to another planet. You're on Fifth Avenue, somewhere in the 50s or 60s, and you're standing in front of a mansion. Not an apartment, not a house, a mansion. A full-blown, architect-designed stone and marble mansion that occupies an entire city block and contains more rooms than you can count from the sidewalk. This is where the other half lives. Actually, that expression, the other half, comes from Jacob Riis, the journalist and photographer whose 1890 book, How the Other Half Lives, exposed tenement conditions to the middle and upper classes. The phrase has become a cliché, but standing on Fifth Avenue in 1905, it takes on a visceral meaning. The distance between the tenement on the Lower East Side and the mansion on Fifth Avenue is about 4 miles. The distance between the lives lived in those two buildings is incalculable. The Gilded Age is technically over. Historians generally end it around 1900. But nobody has told the people living on Fifth Avenue. The great families of New York, the Astors, the Vanderbilts, the Carnegies, the Morgans, the Whitneys, live in a world of staggering wealth and unimaginable luxury. Their homes are modelled on European palaces. Their dinners involve 12 courses. Their wardrobes are maintained by teams of servants. Their social lives revolve around an elaborate calendar of balls, dinners, opera performances, and Newport summers that would exhaust a professional event planner. The Vanderbilt family alone occupies multiple mansions on Fifth Avenue. The twin brownstones built by William Henry Vanderbilt occupy an entire block in the 50s. Cornelius Vanderbilt II's home, at 57th Street and Fifth Avenue, is said to be the largest private residence in the city. These homes contain ballrooms, libraries, art galleries, servants' quarters, wine cellars, and every conceivable luxury. The furniture is imported from Europe. The art on the walls includes works by old masters purchased at auction for sums that would fund a tenement building's rent for a decade. The daily life of a wealthy New Yorker in 1905 bears almost no resemblance to the daily life you have been living in the tenements. A woman of the upper class rises late. There is no coal stove to start because servants handle all domestic work. She is dressed by a lady's maid who manages the elaborate wardrobe of corsets, petticoats, and gowns that upper-class fashion demands. Breakfast is served in a dining room by uniformed staff. The morning is spent on correspondence, social calls, and the management of a household staff that might number 20 or 30 people. Lunch is a formal affair. The afternoon might involve a carriage ride through Central Park, a visit to a dressmaker, or a meeting with a charitable committee. Dinner is a multi-hour production involving formal dress, multiple courses, and conversation that adheres to strict rules of etiquette. Here is a historical fact that captures the scale of wealth in this era. In 1905, the richest 1% of American families own more wealth than the bottom 99% combined. This is not an estimate or an exaggeration. The concentration of wealth in the hands of a tiny elite is one of the defining features of the period, and it creates social tensions that will eventually lead to the progressive reforms of the next 2 decades. Income taxes, trust busting, labour laws. But right now, the wealth sits where it sits, and the gap between rich and poor is visible on every block of Manhattan. The rich do not live entirely separate from the poor, of course. They depend on the poor, for labour, for service, for the countless daily tasks that maintain their lifestyle. A Fifth Avenue mansion employs cooks, maids, butlers, footmen, laundresses, gardeners, coachmen, and various other specialised workers. These employees live either in servants' quarters within the mansion or in their own modest homes, travelling to work each day. The relationship between employer and servant is governed by custom and hierarchy, with strict rules about behaviour, dress, and communication. Servants use the back stairs, eat in the kitchen, and address their employers with formal titles. The intimacy of the relationship, servants know every detail of their employers' private lives, coexists with an unbridgeable social distance. There is a quirky detail about upper-class New York life in this era that always strikes me as both absurd and revealing. The social elite of the city maintained a formal list of acceptable acquaintances, the so-called 400, a number said to represent the capacity of Mrs. William Astor's ballroom. If you were on the list, you existed socially. If you were not, you did not, regardless of your wealth, your accomplishments, or your character. The list was maintained by Ward McAllister, a self-appointed social arbiter, until his death in 1895, after which the social hierarchy became somewhat more fluid, but no less rigid. The idea that 400 people constituted the entirety of acceptable society in a city of nearly 4 million says everything about the worldview of the upper class. Historians still argue whether the Gilded Age elite were primarily builders who created the institutions, infrastructure, and economic growth that benefited the nation, or primarily robber barons who extracted wealth from workers and communities. The answer depends on which Vanderbilt you are looking at, which Carnegie Library you're standing in, and whether you're standing in the reading room or in the factory that funded it. You peer through the iron fence at the mansion's front garden, and then you turn back toward the avenue, and you keep walking south, toward the tenements, toward the life you know. The mansion recedes behind you, and the crowds thicken, and the smell returns, and you are home again, or at least you are where you live, which in 1905 is not always the same thing. But before you go home, you have something rare and precious, an afternoon off. Maybe the factory closed early. Maybe the ship you were unloading finished ahead of schedule. Maybe it is Sunday, which is the one day most workers have something resembling free time. Whatever the reason, you have a few hours and you know exactly where to spend them. Central Park. The park is almost 50 years old by 1905, having been designed by Frederick Law Olmsted and Calvert Vaux beginning in 1858. It stretches from 59th Street to 110th Street, 840 acres of green space in the middle of an island that is otherwise being consumed by development at a ferocious rate. Olmsted designed the park as a democratic space, a place where all classes of New Yorkers could come together and experience nature, or at least a carefully curated version of it. In 1905, the park is fulfilling that vision more completely than Olmsted might have imagined, and perhaps in ways he did not entirely intend. You enter the park from the south, through one of the ornamental gates, and the city falls away with a suddenness that feels almost magical. The noise diminishes, the smell changes, trees and grass and earth replacing horse manure and coal smoke. The air is cleaner, or at least it feels cleaner, and the sky opens up above you in a way that is impossible. In the narrow streets of the Lower East Side, you take a breath, you take another. Something in your chest unclenches. The park is crowded because it is always crowded on a nice day. Families spread blankets on the grass and eat picnic lunches. Children run and shout. Couples stroll along the winding paths. Old men sit on benches and read newspapers in a dozen languages. Nursemaids push baby carriages along the mall, the wide promenade lined with American elms that is the park's grand social stage. On the mall, the social classes mix in a way they do not elsewhere. The immigrant family from the Lower East Side walks the same path as the merchant's family from Murray Hill and the society matron from the Upper East Side. They do not interact necessarily, but they occupy the same space, and in a city as divided as New York that counts for something. The park offers a range of diversions. You can row a boat on the lake, which is a man-made body of water surrounded by carefully designed landscapes that make it look natural. Boating costs a small fee, but watching the boats is free. You can visit the zoo, actually called the menagerie at this point, a small collection of animals housed in buildings near the arsenal. The menagerie has bears, monkeys, birds, and whatever else has been donated or captured, and it is wildly popular with children and adults alike. You can listen to a band concert at the bandstand, where free musical performances are offered on weekends and holidays. Here is a historical fact that makes the park even more remarkable. Before Central Park was built, the land it occupies was home to Seneca Village, a predominantly black community that had been established in the 1820s. The village included homes, churches, schools and cemeteries, and its residents were displaced through eminent domain when the city decided to build the park. The destruction of Seneca Village is one of the less celebrated chapters in the park's history, and historians still argue about the extent to which racial prejudice influenced the decision to locate the park on land occupied by a thriving black community, rather than on one of the other proposed sites. The park has rules, of course. You're not supposed to walk on the grass, though everyone does. You're not supposed to pick flowers. You're not supposed to gamble, play ball games in unauthorized areas, or allow your dog to run loose. The park police enforce these rules with varying degrees of enthusiasm, and the list of prohibited activities has grown steadily since the park's opening. But the overall atmosphere is one of relaxation and escape, a temporary reprieve from the grinding demands of daily life. There is a quirky detail about Central Park in this era that delights me. The park sheep, yes, sheep. The sheep meadow, which today is a large open lawn popular with sunbathers, was in 1905 an actual meadow with actual sheep. A flock of about 200 Southdown sheep was kept in the park and grazed on the meadow, tended by a shepherd employed by the city. The sheep served the dual purpose of maintaining the grass and providing a pastoral atmosphere that Olmsted considered essential to the park's design. The sheepfold where the animals were housed at night will eventually be converted into the Tavern on the Green restaurant, but right now it is a working sheep barn in the middle of Manhattan. This fact never fails to make modern New Yorkers do a double take. You find a bench near the Bethesda Fountain, the magnificent Angel of the Waters sculpture that is the centerpiece of the park's formal terrace, and you sit. The fountain is surrounded by people, a man sketching in a notebook, two women in conversation, a child throwing pennies into the water and making wishes that the penny economy of her life desperately needs granted. The water catches the afternoon light. The trees around the terrace are tall and full. For a moment, just a moment, you can forget where you live, how you live, and what is waiting for you when you leave the park. But the light is changing, the shadows are getting longer, the families are packing up their picnic blankets, the nursemaids are turning the baby carriages toward home. You stand, stretch, and begin the walk back to the gates, back to the streets, back to the noise and the smell and the life. The park does not fix anything. but it gives you a place to breathe. And in this city, in this year, that is not nothing. And if you have a whole day off, a Sunday, a holiday, one of those rare stretches of unscheduled time that feel almost illicit in their freedom, there is another escape, one that is louder and brighter and more deliberately joyful than anything Central Park can offer. You take the train to Brooklyn, and then you take another train to the end of the line, and you step out into the absolute sensory explosion that is Coney Island. Coney Island in 1905 is in the middle of its golden age, and there is truly nothing else like it on Earth. The beachfront amusement area at the southern tip of Brooklyn has transformed from a somewhat disreputable resort into a full-blown fantasia of entertainment, spectacle, and mechanical thrill. 3 enormous amusement parks compete for your attention and your nickels: Steeplechase Park, Luna Park, and Dreamland. Together they represent the cutting edge of popular entertainment and an entirely new idea about what fun looks like. Luna Park, which opened in 1903, is the most dazzling of the 3. It covers 38 acres and is decorated with 250,000 electric light bulbs, an insane number for the era, that transform it into a city of light after dark. The park's towers, minarets, and fanciful architecture create a skyline that looks like a fever dream of Baghdad, crossed with an amusement park designer's opium vision. The attractions include a trip to the moon, a simulated journey in a winged airship that takes passengers through a theatrical moon landscape populated by moon people, and a recreation of a flood, complete with rushing water and a miniature city being destroyed. The spectacle is the point. Luna Park is designed to overwhelm the senses of people whose daily lives are overwhelmed in very different and much less pleasant ways. Steeplechase Park, owned by George Tillieu, is the oldest of the 3 parks and the most participatory. Its signature ride is the Steeplechase, a gravity-powered ride where patrons sit on mechanical horses that race along parallel tracks at speeds that feel genuinely dangerous and probably are. The park is designed around active entertainment. You do not just watch, you participate. There are slides, swings, barrel rolls and obstacle courses, many of which are designed to throw riders off balance, knock them into each other, and generally produce the kind of physical comedy that Victorian audiences found hilarious and modern safety inspectors would find actionable. Dreamland, the newest and most ambitious of the 3 parks, opened just the year before in 1904. It is meant to be classier and more educational than its competitors, with attractions that include a recreation of the fall of Pompeii, a miniature city populated entirely by people with dwarfism, a concept that is deeply problematic by modern standards, but was presented as entertainment in this era, and an incubator facility where premature babies were displayed and cared for. That last detail deserves emphasis. Dr. Martin Cowney, a physician who championed incubator technology for premature infants, at a time when most hospitals considered them a waste of resources, set up his incubators at Dreamland and at other amusement parks, charging admission to see the tiny babies. The babies received state-of-the-art care. The admission fees funded the operation and the arrangement, while bizarre actually saved thousands of lives over the years. Historians still argue whether Cowney was a visionary or an opportunist, but the babies he saved were real, and many of them lived to old age. The beach itself is a spectacle. On a hot summer day, the sand is packed with thousands of people in bathing costumes that by modern standards cover almost everything. Women wear full-body wool bathing suits with stockings and caps. Men wear one-piece suits that cover the torso and extend to mid-thigh. The amount of fabric involved in a day at the beach is remarkable, and the weight of a wool bathing suit when wet is something that anyone who has experienced it never forgets. Swimming is popular but dangerous. The surf at Coney Island can be rough, and lifeguard services are limited. Here is a quirky detail about Coney Island entertainment that captures the era perfectly. One of the most popular attractions is a ride called the Helter Skelter, a giant slide that sends riders down a series of undulating bumps on burlap sacks. But the real attraction is at the bottom of the slide, where hidden air jets blast upward, designed specifically to blow women's skirts up. The audience gathers to watch. This is considered hilarious entertainment. The fact that it is essentially a device for publicly exposing women's undergarments does not diminish its popularity, and if anything, increases it. Coney Island exists in a space where the normal rules of propriety are suspended, and attractions like the Helter Skelter exploit that suspension with gleeful shamelessness. The food at Coney Island is its own category of experience. Hot dogs, this is actually where the hot dog begins its ascent to American econ status, are sold from stands along the boardwalk. Cotton candy, popcorn, saltwater taffy, ice cream, corn on the cob, and every other portable food imaginable is available. The smell of frying food, ocean salt, and the vaguely chemical scent of amusement park machinery creates a perfume that is unique to Coney Island and that will, in decades to come, be one of the most powerful nostalgia triggers in the American sensory library. You ride the rides, you eat the food, you watch the lights come on as the sun goes down, and for a few hours the grinding reality of tenement life is replaced by something that feels almost like magic. It is engineered magic, commercial magic, magic that costs a nickel per ride, but it is the closest thing to escape that most working-class New Yorkers will ever experience. You ride the train home in the dark, tired and happy and carrying the smell of the ocean and fried food in your clothes, and for a little while, the city seems like a place where good things are possible. Sunday arrives, and the city takes on a different rhythm. The factories are mostly closed. The pushcarts are fewer. The streets are quieter, though quiet is a relative term in New York. And for millions of New Yorkers, Sunday means one thing above all others: worship. The religious landscape of New York in 1905 is as diverse as its ethnic landscape, and the two are intertwined so tightly that they cannot be separated. Every immigrant community has brought its faith along with its language and its food, and the result is a city where the spiritual infrastructure is as dense and varied as the physical one. On the Lower East Side, the Jewish community maintains hundreds of synagogues, ranging from grand buildings with professional cantors to converted storefronts where a minyan gathers in a room not much bigger than the apartments they live in. The Jewish population of New York is growing rapidly. The great wave of Eastern European Jewish immigration is in full flow, and the religious community is grappling with questions of identity, tradition, and adaptation that mirror the broader immigrant experience. Orthodox Jews maintain strict observance of the Sabbath and dietary laws. Reform Jews embrace a more Americanized practice. The tensions between these approaches play out in families, in synagogues, and in the pages of the Yiddish press, where the debate about what it means to be Jewish in America is conducted with passionate intensity. In Little Italy, the Catholic Church is the center of community life. Every neighborhood has its parish, and every parish has its saint, and the feast days of those saints are among the most spectacular public celebrations in the city. The Feast of San Gennaro, held every September on Mulberry Street, transforms the neighborhood into a carnival of food, music, processions, and devotion. The Italian immigrants bring with them a form of Catholicism that is deeply personal, intensely physical, and not always in perfect alignment with the institutional church as run by the largely Irish Catholic hierarchy. The tension between Italian popular Catholicism, with its home altars, its saint cards, its intense devotion to the Madonna, and the more austere institutional Catholicism of the Irish American Church is one of the quieter but more persistent conflicts within the Catholic community. The Irish Catholics, who arrived a generation earlier, have built the institutional infrastructure of American Catholicism in New York. St. Patrick's Cathedral on Fifth Avenue, completed in 1878, is the most visible symbol of Irish Catholic achievement, a massive Gothic structure that stands among the mansions of the Protestant elite like a declaration of arrival. The Irish run the Archdiocese, the Catholic schools, the Catholic hospitals, and the Catholic charities, and the arrival of millions of Italian and Polish Catholics has created a complex internal politics of ethnicity and power within the Church. The Protestant churches of New York serve a different population. The old-line Protestant families, the Episcopalians, Presbyterians, Congregationalists, worship in churches that reflect their social position, with stained glass, organ music, and sermons that address the moral concerns of the comfortable. But there are also storefront churches in poor neighborhoods, mission churches that combine worship with social services, and the early stirrings of the Pentecostal and holiness movements that will reshape American Protestantism in the coming decades. Here is a detail about religious life in this period that captures the intersection of faith and superstition beautifully. Among many immigrant communities, folk beliefs exist alongside formal religious practice in ways that would surprise a modern observer. The evil eye, the belief that envy or malice can cause harm through a look, is taken seriously in Italian and Greek communities. Amulets are worn for protection. Certain prayers are believed to have curative power. Among Eastern European Jews, elements of folk belief, golems, dibbuks, the protective power of certain psalms, coexist with formal rabbinic Judaism. And in Chinatown, traditional Chinese religious practice, ancestor worship, temple offerings, the consultation of fortune tellers, continues alongside the small but growing influence of Christian missionaries. The religious life of the city is not a neat map of denominations. It is a tangle of belief, tradition, superstition, and adaptation, and the boundaries between them are porous. Historians still argue whether religion in this era served primarily as a source of comfort and community for immigrants, or as a mechanism of social control that reinforced existing power structures. Once again, the answer is both, and the proportion varies depending on which church, which rabbis, which priest, and which congregation you are examining. There is a quirky fact about religious observance in Tenement, New York that I find endlessly human. Many tenement families maintained a small religious shrine in their apartment, an icon in the corner, a menorah on the shelf, a crucifix on the wall, a picture of a saint near the door. These small objects served as anchors in a chaotic world, reminders of continuity in a life defined by disruption. They were carried across oceans, up 5 flights of stairs, and into rooms that had never been intended for sacred use. The fact that people made space for them, in apartments where there was barely space for the living, tells you something about the enduring power of belief. You go to your service or you do not. You pray or you do not. Either way, Sunday passes, and Monday is coming, and Monday does not care what you believe. Monday comes, and it brings with it a fear that lives at the back of every tenement dweller's mind, a fear so common and so justified that it barely needs to be named. Fire. The tenement buildings of the Lower East Side are fire traps. This is not a metaphor. They are wooden structures, many of them built decades ago with no regard for fire safety, packed with flammable materials, heated by coal stoves with open flames, lit by gas jets and candles, and filled with human beings who have limited means of escape. The staircases are narrow and wooden, the hallways are dark. The fire escapes, where they exist, are often blocked by stored belongings, iced over in winter, or structurally unsound. The buildings are packed so closely together that fire can jump from one to another in seconds. Fires in tenement buildings are common, devastatingly, routinely common. The newspapers report them almost daily. Small fires that are contained, large fires that consume entire buildings, and occasionally catastrophic fires that take out whole blocks. The causes are predictable: an overturned kerosene lamp, a spark from a coal stove, a child playing with matches, a gas line leak, or the spontaneous combustion of rags and fabric in a garment workshop. Once a fire starts in a tenement, it moves fast. The wooden construction, the fabric stored in apartments where piecework is done, the accumulated grime and grease, everything feeds the flames. The fire department in 1905 is brave, well organised, and drastically outmatched. Firefighters respond to tenement fires with horse-drawn apparatus, hand-pumped and steam-powered engines, and ladders that cannot reach the upper floors of the tallest buildings. The technology is improving, motorised fire trucks are beginning to appear. But the fundamental problem remains. The buildings are built to burn, and the city is built of buildings. The firefighters know this. They fight the fires anyway, and the casualty rate among firemen is high. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire is 6 years away in 1911. That disaster, which will kill 146 garment workers, most of them young immigrant women, will become the most famous industrial fire in American history and will catalyse sweeping reforms in building codes, fire safety and labour laws. But the conditions that will produce the Triangle Fire exist right now, in 1905, in hundreds of buildings throughout the city. The locked doors, the inadequate fire escapes, the flammable materials, the overcrowding, all of it is already in place. The disaster is not a surprise, it is a certainty waiting for a date. Beyond fire, the buildings themselves are a hazard. Structural collapses occur with disturbing frequency. Tenement buildings are often poorly built, inadequately maintained, and subjected to stresses they were never designed to bear. A building that was constructed for 20 occupants but houses 60 is under strain that shows in cracking plaster, sagging floors, and walls that lean in directions that walls should not lean. Building inspectors exist, but they are few. They are sometimes corrupt, and the landlords have more interest in collecting rent than in making repairs. Here is a historical fact that captures the fire danger vividly. In the winter months, when coal stoves burn at their maximum and buildings are sealed tight against the cold, tenement fires spike dramatically. The Department of Buildings and the Fire Department issue warnings and recommendations that are routinely ignored because following them would require money that landlords do not want to spend and structural modifications that the buildings cannot accommodate. The fire death toll in New York City in this period runs to hundreds per year, and the majority of victims are residents of the poorest neighbourhoods. Historians still argue whether the reform movements that followed disasters like the Triangle Fire were inevitable consequences of progressive politics, or whether they required specific catalysts. The horrifying spectacle of young women jumping from burning buildings in full view of the public, to overcome the resistance of business interests and compliant politicians. The evidence suggests that progress required both conditions: a reform movement strong enough to act and a disaster terrible enough to make inaction impossible. There is a detail about fire safety in the tenements that is both practical and deeply sad. Many tenement families kept a rope coiled near the window, a length of clothesline or any available cord, as an improvised fire escape. The idea was that in a fire you could tie the rope to something in the apartment and lower yourself to the ground, or at least to a lower floor. Whether this would actually work in a real fire, with smoke and panic and a rope that might not be long enough, is questionable. But the rope was there, a small gesture of preparedness in a world where the institutions that were supposed to protect you, building codes, fire inspections, landlord responsibility, had consistently failed. You check the stove before you leave the apartment. You make sure the gas jet is off. You close the door and test it. These small rituals of safety are all you have. The building creaks around you, settling into its bones, and you walk down the stairs into another day, hoping that today is not the day the fire comes. You descend into the street, and there is a newsboy on the corner. Remember the newsboys from earlier. And today he is shouting something that catches your ear. A headline, a scandal, a catastrophe. The newspaper is your lifeline to the wider world, and in 1905 the newspapers of New York are engaged in a war for your attention that is as fierce, as entertaining, and as morally questionable as anything happening on the streets. This is the age of yellow journalism, the period when newspaper publishers William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer are competing for circulation with tactics that include sensationalism, fabrication, and emotional manipulation on a scale that makes modern tabloids look restrained. Hearst's New York Journal and Pulitzer's New York World are the two heavyweights, and their battle has been reshaping American media for the past decade. The term yellow journalism itself comes from the Yellow Kid, a popular comic strip character whose publication rights were fought over by the two papers, and it has come to mean any journalism that prioritizes sensation over accuracy, emotion over fact. The newspapers are big, not figuratively, physically big. A daily paper might run 16 to 24 pages, broadsheet format, packed with news, opinion, advertising, illustrations, and serial fiction. They cost a penny or two, which means they are accessible to almost everyone, and their circulation numbers reflect this. The World and the Journal each sell hundreds of thousands of copies daily, and on big news days the numbers spike even higher. The Spanish-American War just 7 years ago was partly manufactured by Hearst's newspapers through sensationalized reporting. The famous, possibly apocryphal instruction, "You furnish the pictures and I'll furnish the war," captures the ethos perfectly, whether Hearst actually said it or not. But the newspapers are not just about sensation, they are also, for millions of New Yorkers, the primary source of information about everything from world affairs to local politics to the weather. The papers publish detailed coverage of city government, court proceedings, business news, and social events. They run advice columns, recipes, fashion pages, and sports coverage. The sports section is growing rapidly, reflecting the rising popularity of baseball. The New York Giants are the city's dominant team in 1905, and they will win the World Series this year, as well as boxing, horse racing, and other spectator sports. For the immigrant communities, the foreign language press is even more important than the English language papers. The Jewish Daily Forward, published in Yiddish, is a combination of news source, social service, and cultural institution. Its editor, Abraham Kahan, is one of the most influential figures in the immigrant community. The Forward's Bintel Brief column, essentially an advice column where readers write in with problems and receive counsel, is required reading on the Lower East Side. The letters and responses provide a remarkable window into the daily concerns of immigrant life: marital problems, conflicts between parents and Americanizing children, workplace disputes, questions about religion and identity. The foreword does not just report on the community, it shapes it. The Italian papers, the German papers, the Chinese papers, each serves a similar function for its community, providing news in a language the readers can understand and addressing concerns that the English language papers ignore or misunderstand. Historians still argue about whether the foreign language press facilitated assimilation by connecting immigrants to American life or delayed assimilation by allowing them to remain in a linguistic bubble. The reality, predictably, is that it did both, depending on the paper, the reader, and the moment. Here is a quirky detail about newspaper culture in 1905 that always makes me smile. Because paper was expensive and most workers could not afford to buy a paper every day, sharing was universal. A single copy of the foreword might pass through 10 or 20 hands in a day. Men read the paper at the barbershop, at the saloon, and on the factory floor during lunch. Papers were left on park benches and subway seats for the next person to find. The newspaper was a communal resource, not a private possession, and the social ritual of reading and discussing the day's news was one of the threads that held the community together. You buy a paper, or you pick one up that someone has left on a bench, and you scan the headlines: politics, crime, disaster, scandal. The world is chaotic and the news reflects the chaos, but the paper also contains something else: the serial novel, the funny pages, the small items of human interest that remind you that the world is also strange and wonderful, and occasionally kind. You fold the paper under your arm and keep walking. The news will keep until tonight, when you can read it properly, by the light of the gas lamp in your apartment, while the city settles into something almost like silence. And now the light really is failing. The sun drops behind the buildings to the west and the city transforms. This transformation is both literal and atmospheric, because the technology of illumination in 1905 is in the middle of its own revolution, and you can see the past and the future side by side on any street. Gaslight has been the dominant form of street lighting for decades. Gas lamps line the avenues and many of the side streets, and at dusk, lamplighters make their rounds with long poles, reaching up to each lamp to open the gas valve and ignite the flame. The quality of gaslight is warm and soft, a golden yellow that casts pools of light on the sidewalk with deep shadows between them. The effect is romantic, if you are feeling generous and menacing. If you are walking alone through an unfamiliar neighbourhood, gaslight does not illuminate, it suggests. You can see enough to walk usually, but the details of the world around you are blurred, softened, half hidden. The city at night under gaslight is a place of impressions rather than facts, but electricity is coming, and it is changing everything. Electric streetlights are being installed along the major avenues, and the difference is startling. Where gaslight is soft and warm, electric light is bright and harsh, a white-blue glare that reveals every detail of the street below. The electric lights make the city feel both safer and stranger. Safer because you can see more clearly. Stranger because the things you can see more clearly are the same dirt, garbage and exhaustion that gaslight had the decency to obscure. The process of electrification is uneven. Wealthy neighbourhoods and commercial districts get electric lights first. The poorest neighbourhoods get them last, if at all. In 1905, many tenement apartments still rely on gaslight for interior illumination, and some of the poorest homes still use kerosene lamps or candles. The gap between the electrically illuminated world of Broadway and the gaslit dimness of the Lower East Side is another manifestation of the inequality that defines the city. Broadway in particular is becoming something extraordinary. The stretch of Broadway around Longacre Square, which is just now being renamed Times Square in honour of the New York Times, which has moved its headquarters to the New Times Tower, is emerging as the most brilliantly lit street in the world. Electric signs, powered by thousands of incandescent bulbs, are appearing on building facades, advertising everything from chewing gum to corsets to upcoming theatrical productions. The effect at night is dazzling, a cascade of light that turns the street into something that has never existed before. A public space designed to be experienced after dark, a place where the night is not an obstacle but an opportunity. Broadway is earning the nickname the Great White Way, and it is pulling the centre of New York's nightlife uptown from the old Bowery and Tenderloin districts toward what will become the theatre district. Here is a historical fact about electrification that connects to everything else we've discussed. The electricity that powers these lights, and increasingly, the machines and appliances of daily life, is generated by coal-fired power plants, most of them located in the city itself. The coal that fuels the power plants is delivered by ship and barge. The smoke from the power plants adds to the already impressive pollution of the city's air. The ash from the coal must be disposed of somewhere. The workers in the power plants are working in conditions that are dangerous and poorly regulated. The miracle of electric light, in other words, has a supply chain that runs through the same systems of labour exploitation, environmental degradation, and social inequality that define every other aspect of life in 1905. The light is beautiful. The cost of the light is not. You walk through the city at night and you notice the layers of light. The bright electric glare of a commercial street. The softer glow of a gaslit block. The warm flicker of a candle or kerosene lamp in a tenement window. The complete darkness of an alley or an unlit side street, where the night is as absolute as it would be in the countryside. The city is a patchwork of illumination and shadow, and you navigate it by instinct, moving from light to light the way a moth moves from flame to flame. Historians still argue about the social impact of electrification, and specifically whether the extension of usable hours into the night was primarily a benefit to workers, who could now read, socialise and organise after dark, or primarily a benefit to employers, who could now demand evening and night shifts in factories that previously shut down at sundown. The answer, in the grand tradition of historical complexity, is both. There is a quirky detail about nighttime in this era that I find surprisingly poignant. Many tenement families could not afford gaslighting for their apartments, even when it was available. They would sit in the dark after sunset, talking, singing, telling stories from the old country. Children did homework by the light of a candle stub. Piecework, the sewing and finishing that supplemented family income, was done by whatever light could be obtained, even if that meant working by the light of a window that caught the glow of a street lamp outside. The intimacy of those dark apartments, where families gathered in a small pool of light and the rest of the room disappeared into shadow, is something that the fully electrified modern world has lost entirely. The night deepens, the crowds thin. The saloons are still lit, the dance hall still thumping, but the working city is shutting down. You walk toward home. You climb the stairs of your tenement building for the last time today. 5 flights, each one a little darker and a little more creaky than the last. The stairwell smells like cabbage and kerosene and human habitation, a smell so familiar that you no longer register it as a smell at all. It is simply the scent of home, or what passes for home. You open the door to the apartment and the day's accumulation of life is everywhere. The coal stove is cooling, its fire banked for the night, giving off the last of its warmth in a room that will be cold by morning. The remains of dinner, potato soup, bread, maybe a bit of onion and herring, are on the table. The dishes are washed and stacked on the shelf. The children, if there are children, are asleep or getting there, arranged on their pallets and cots and makeshift beds like small exhausted packages. Your cousin and his wife are in the back room. The boarders are settling in. The apartment is configured for sleeping now, which means the daytime furniture, the chairs pushed aside, the table shoved against the wall, has been rearranged to create maximum floor space for maximum bodies. You remove your shoes, you remove your coat, your vest, your shirt. You change into the undershirt you sleep in, which is also the undershirt you worked in yesterday. Because the laundry situation being what it is, you work with what you have. And you lie down on your cot and the cot creaks under your weight, and you feel every hour of the day settling into your bones. Your back aches from bending over a sewing machine or hauling cargo or whatever labour the day demanded. Your hands are sore, your feet are sore. You are tired in a way that is not simply physical but existential. The tiredness of a person who has spent every waking moment in the service of survival and who will do the same thing tomorrow and the day after and the day after that, for as long as your body holds out. The sounds of the building settle around you like a blanket. The man upstairs is coughing again, that deep wet cough that has not gotten better and is not going to get better. A baby is crying somewhere, a thin, tired sound that will continue intermittently through the night. Voices murmur through the walls, an argument, a conversation, a prayer, impossible to tell at this distance. The building is never silent. It is a living organism made of wood and brick and people, and its breathing never stops. You stare at the ceiling and you think. Or you try not to think, because thinking is sometimes a luxury you cannot afford. You think about money, because money is the axis around which everything turns. You earned $6 this week. The rent is $12 a month. The food costs roughly $2 a week. Coal is another $1. The borders contribute a few dollars. The arithmetic works out just barely, with nothing left over for emergencies. And emergencies are not possibilities. They are certainties. Someone will get sick. Something will break. A job will disappear. The margin between survival and catastrophe is so thin you can see through it. Here is a mainstream historical fact that puts your anxious calculations into a broader context. In 1905, there is no safety net, no unemployment insurance, no social security, no food stamps, no Medicaid, no disability payments, no public housing, nothing. If you lose your job, you rely on family, on your community, on the ward boss, on the charity of strangers, and if all of those fail, you end up on the street or in the poorhouse, a publicly funded institution for the destitute that is deliberately kept as grim as possible to discourage people from seeking its help. The fear of the poorhouse is real and constant, a shadow at the edge of every tenement dweller's consciousness. You work because the alternative is unthinkable. There is a curious and somewhat poignant detail about sleeping in the tenements that most histories overlook. Many families maintained bedtime rituals that were carried over from the old country. Prayers said in languages that the children were already beginning to forget. Songs hummed in the dark, the arrangement of pillows and blankets in specific patterns that had been followed for generations. These rituals were acts of continuity in a world of rupture, small anchors to an identity that the process of immigration was steadily eroding. A grandmother singing a Yiddish lullaby in a tenement on Hester Street is performing an act of cultural preservation, whether she thinks of it that way or not. Historians still argue whether the immigrant experience of this era was primarily one of loss, the old world left behind, the culture diluted, the identity fractured, or primarily one of creation, a new culture emerging from the collision of old traditions and new realities. The answer, as you might expect by now, is both. Everything in this city is both. You close your eyes, the cot is hard, the room is cold, the sounds of the building wrap around you, the coughing, the murmuring, the distant cry of a baby, the creak of floorboards as someone shifts in their sleep. You breathe in the smell of the apartment, the coal and the cabbage and the wool and the human closeness. Your muscles begin to unclench. The tension that has held your body rigid since 5:30 this morning begins, slowly, to release. Sleep comes, not easily, not completely, but it comes. And in sleep the city disappears, at least for a few hours. But here is the thing about this city, and it is the thing that keeps you here. The thing that keeps everyone here. The thing that draws 3,000 new people through Ellis Island every single day despite everything we have discussed tonight. The filth, the disease, the exhaustion, the exploitation, the impossibly narrow margin of survival. Here is the thing. This city is becoming something. You can feel it in the vibrations of the street, in the rattle of the subway beneath your feet, in the rising steel skeletons of buildings that will be taller than anything the world has ever seen. You can feel it in the energy of the pushcart vendors and the garment workers and the longshoremen and the newsboys, all of them grinding through impossible days, but grinding forward, always forward, towards something that does not yet have a name but that everyone can sense is coming. In 1905, New York City has a population of roughly 4 million people. It is the largest city in the United States by a wide margin and one of the largest in the world. It is growing at a rate that would be terrifying if it were not also exhilarating. The 5 boroughs, Manhattan, Brooklyn, Queens, the Bronx and Staten Island, were consolidated into a single city just 7 years ago, in 1898, creating a metropolis of unprecedented scale. The consolidation was controversial then, and historians still argue about whether it was a triumph of urban planning or a political power grab. Either way, it created the New York that we know, the great sprawling impossible city that spreads across islands and rivers and bridges and tunnels and sheer force of will. The subway system that you rode this morning is just the beginning. Plans are already underway for expansion. New lines, new stations, new tunnels under the rivers, connecting Manhattan to Brooklyn and to the new developments in Queens and the Bronx. The Pennsylvania Railroad is building a tunnel under the Hudson River that will connect Manhattan directly to New Jersey and beyond that, to the entire Continental Railroad network. When it opens in 1910, Penn Station will be one of the grandest buildings in America, a cathedral of transportation that declares, in stone and steel, that New York is the center of the American world. The buildings are rising. The Singer Building, which will be completed in 1908, will be the tallest building in the world at 612 feet. It will hold that record for only a year before being surpassed by the Metropolitan Life Tower, which will itself be surpassed by the Woolworth Building in 1913. The race upward is accelerating, driven by advances in steel construction, elevator technology, and the sheer ambition of a city that has decided that the sky is not a limit but a starting point. The culture is exploding. Tin Pan Alley is churning out the popular music that will define the first half of the 20th century. Vaudeville is at its peak, and the theatre district is expanding. The Nickelodeons, small storefront theatres showing short films for a nickel, are appearing on every block, harbingers of the motion picture industry that will transform entertainment worldwide. The Yiddish Theatre on the Lower East Side is producing performances of astonishing quality, dramas, comedies, musicals, that will influence American theatre for decades to come. Here is a detail about what is happening beneath the surface of the city in this year that captures the paradox beautifully. In the same neighbourhoods where children are working in sweatshops and babies are dying of contaminated milk, people are organising. Labour unions are growing. The Socialist Party is gaining members. Women are meeting in rented halls to plan the campaigns that will lead to suffrage. Settlement house workers are documenting conditions and pushing for reform. Journalists are investigating corruption. Lawyers are filing cases. The energy that will produce the progressive era, the great wave of social reform that will reshape American life over the next 2 decades, is building block by block, meeting by meeting, article by article, right here in the tenements and the factories and the streets of New York. The city is a contradiction. It is cruel and it is generous. It is filthy and it is beautiful. It is a death trap and it is a cradle. It grinds people down and it lifts people up, sometimes the same people, sometimes on the same day. It is the worst place in America to be poor and the best place in America to become something else. It makes no promises and breaks no promises, because the promises were always yours to make and yours to keep. You're lying on your cot in your tenement on the Lower East Side, and the year is 1905, and the century is young, and the city is young, and you, despite everything, despite the aching back and the empty pockets and the cough you're trying to ignore, you're young too, or at least young enough to believe that tomorrow might be different. And tomorrow might be different. That is the secret of this place. Not that tomorrow will be different, because there are no guarantees in New York, in 1905 or in any other year. But that it might be. The possibility is the engine. The possibility is what fills the ships and the trains and the subway cars. The possibility is what keeps the lights on in the sweatshops at midnight and the pushcarts rolling at dawn. And now, let the city grow quiet around you. Let the sounds soften. The coughing fades. The baby stops crying. The murmuring voices settle into silence one by one, like candles being extinguished in a long hallway. The building breathes. The street outside for once is almost still. A horse clopping slowly past. The sound growing fainter, fading. Gone. Your breathing slows. Your muscles release. The cot holds you. The blanket covers you. The dark is complete, and the dark is kind, and the city, for this one moment, asks nothing of you at all. The airshaft window lets in a sliver of moonlight, just enough to see the outline of the room, just enough to remind you that the world is still there, waiting, patient. Sleep now. Let the century turn in its sleep. Let the bridges stretch and the buildings rise and the ships come in and the music play. Let the city do what it does. You have done enough for today. Tomorrow the pushcart vendors will call. Tomorrow the subway will rattle. Tomorrow the newsboys will shout the headlines of a world that is changing faster than anyone can follow. But that is tomorrow. Tonight. Tonight is yours. The pillow is soft enough. The blanket is warm enough. The silence is deep enough. Close your eyes. Let go. The city will keep.